the cradle of civilization, long before the modern world, before towering cities, bustling streets, and the digital pulse of humanity. There existed a region that many scholars consider the birthplace of civilization itself. This region, nestled between the winding courses of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now modern-day Iraq, has been called Mesopotamia, which literally means between rivers. In this fertile land, the earliest known complex societies began to take shape, societies that would leave an indelible mark on human history, even if much of their world is now buried beneath layers of sand, soil, and time. The story of Sumer, one of the first civilizations in this region, begins with small communities of farmers who learned to harness the richness of the riverbanks. The land was both a blessing and a challenge. Floods brought nutrient-rich silt that made the soil extraordinarily fertile. But those same floods were unpredictable and often destructive. Learning to manage the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates became a matter of survival. Through the construction of canals, levees, and rudimentary irrigation systems, these early settlers could control the flow of water, channeling it to their fields and ensuring a steady supply of crops. Such innovations were not the work of a single person or generation, but the product of communities experimenting, failing, and slowly understanding the rhythms of their environment. It is tempting to imagine these early Sumerians as simply farmers, but in reality, they were the seeds of a society that would grow in complexity. From the need to coordinate irrigation and manage agricultural production, arose forms of organization that resembled governance. Leaders emerged not through inheritance, at least not at first, but because of their ability to guide their communities through the logistical challenges of daily life. These leaders would later evolve into kings and city rulers, but in the beginning, they were pragmatic figures solving practical problems, ensuring that water reached the crops and that food could be distributed to all who lived along the rivers. By around 4000 BCE, the villages along the southern plains of Mesopotamia began to coalesce into cities. These cities, such as Uruk, Ur, and Er, were remarkable not only for their size, but for the ways in which they structured human life. Streets and homes, public spaces and marketplaces, temples and communal buildings, all of these reflected a society learning to live together on a scale never attempted before. Life within these early cities was not chaotic, but it was far from simple. People learned to specialize, taking on roles that went beyond mere subsistence. Farmers, potters, weavers, metalworkers, and merchants all contributed to the growing complexity of the urban environment. One of the most fascinating aspects of early Sumerian society is how these people began to record their world. The sheer volume of trade, the organization of labor, and the administration of land required a method of keeping track of information. Initially, simple tokens made of clay represented quantities of goods. A small cone might signify a measure of grain. A sphere could represent a herd of sheep. Over time, these tokens evolved into pictographs impressed upon clay tablets, and eventually into cuneiform, writing the first known system of writing in human history. This development was not merely an administrative tool. It marked a profound cognitive leap. The ability to inscribe thoughts, transactions, and stories onto a permanent medium changed the way humans interacted with memory, knowledge, and history itself. Writing allowed the Sumerians not only to manage their cities, but also to reflect on themselves and their place in the universe. They recorded myths and legends, hymns to gods, lists of kings, and the deeds of rulers long past. These texts provide a window into a society that, despite existing more than 5,000 years ago, wrestled with questions that are still familiar today. Who governs us? Why do floods come? What is our purpose in the world? Even in their religious and mythological texts, one senses an awareness of the fragility and resilience of human life, a recognition that existence is as precarious as it is meaningful. Archaeological excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries unearthed thousands of these clay tablets, many of them fragmentary, their surfaces etched with the wedge-shaped marks of styluses pressed into soft clay. When these tablets were deciphered, they revealed an intricate tapestry of life, governance, belief, and aspiration. Kings' lists, for instance, recorded not just the rulers themselves, but also the astonishing lengths of some reigns, blending historical memory with legend. The earliest known city-states, such as Uruk, were depicted as centers of both earthly power and divine favor. Temples dedicated to gods and goddesses dominated the skyline, reminding inhabitants that their lives were intertwined with forces larger than themselves. Temples, often built as ziggurat-stepped, pyramid-like structures, served as both religious centers and hubs of economic activity. Priests were not only spiritual leaders, but also administrators, managing large estates of land, livestock, and laborers. This fusion of the sacred and the secular meant that religious observance and daily economic life were deeply connected, creating a structure in which spirituality was inseparable from governance and social organization. Beyond the cities, life in Sumer was equally complex. Farmers cultivated barley, wheat, and dates, often forming cooperatives to ensure that the land was tilled efficiently. Irrigation channels had to be maintained communally, requiring negotiation, cooperation, and, at times, arbitration by local leaders. The rhythm of the seasons dictated work and ritual alike, with festivals marking moments of planting and harvest, life and death, hope and survival. These early inhabitants were profoundly attuned to their environment, an attunement that would shape not only their economy, but their worldview. Trade expanded Sumerian influence beyond the fertile plains of Mesopotamia. Even in these early centuries, merchants traveled to distant regions, exchanging goods such as timber, stone, and metals for grain and crafted items. This trade fostered connections with neighboring cultures, creating a network of interaction that spread ideas, technologies, and religious beliefs. The Sumerians were innovators, not only in writing and governance, but in engineering, mathematics, and astronomy. They observed the stars, tracked the movements of planets, and developed early calendars, linking celestial patterns to agricultural cycles and religious observances. Despite the vastness of their achievements, the Sumerians lived in a world of uncertainty. Floods, droughts, and occasional invasions could disrupt even the most well-organized city-state. Disease and famine were constant threats. Yet, their capacity to adapt, to innovate, and to record their knowledge allowed them to endure, leaving traces of a civilization whose impact would echo through the millennia. To think of Sumer merely as an ancient society is to underestimate its significance. In the cities, fields, and temples of southern Mesopotamia, humans first experimented with concepts that would define civilization, governance, writing, specialized labor, law, trade, and religious structure. These experiments were not perfect, and many failed or evolved over time, but they laid the foundation for everything that followed. The echoes of Sumerian ingenuity reverberate in the cities we inhabit today, in our systems of writing, our bureaucracies, and even in our collective imagination of human possibility. By studying these earliest records, one begins to grasp how humanity transitioned from scattered villages to organized societies capable of remarkable achievements. The cradle of civilization, as this region is often called, reminds us that human ingenuity has deep roots. It also invites reflection, the complexity of our ancestors' lives, their struggles, and their triumphs are not so distant from our own. Through the lens of Sumer, one can see the beginnings of a story that continues to unfold, a story that asks questions as much as it provides answers. And so, the tale of Sumer begins, not with conquest or empire, but with the quiet, persistent effort of people learning to cultivate the land, manage water, and build communities that could endure. It is a story of small, incremental achievements that, over centuries, became the foundation for the civilizations that followed. In the clay tablets, ziggurats, and fragmented artifacts, there exists a record of human ambition, curiosity, and resilience, a record that may yet change how we understand the very origins of civilization itself. Life along the Tigris and Euphrates landscape of southern Mesopotamia, shaped by the meandering courses of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was both generous and demanding. For those who chose to settle in this fertile land, life revolved around the rhythms of the rivers, the rise and fall of the waters, and the cycles of the seasons. The Tigris and Euphrates were more than mere bodies of water. They were lifelines, sources of nourishment, channels for trade, and sometimes agents of destruction. Understanding and adapting to their behavior became a defining aspect of Sumerian existence. Settlements were often strategically placed along the banks, taking advantage of the rich alluvial soil deposited by seasonal floods. This soil, dark and nutrient-laden, allowed farmers to grow abundant crops, providing sustenance for the growing population. Barley was a staple, and wheat, dates, and legumes supplemented the diet. Livestock such as sheep, goats, and cattle provided not only food but also materials for clothing, tools, and trade. The proximity to water made fishing an essential activity, and reeds harvested along the riverbanks were used for building, writing materials, and various crafts. The rivers, however, demanded constant attention. Annual floods were unpredictable. Some years, the waters barely touched the land. In others, entire fields were submerged, homes destroyed, and harvests ruined. To survive, communities developed early forms of water management, constructing canals to divert water, levees to contain it, and reservoirs to store it for times of scarcity. These projects were collective endeavors, requiring coordination, planning, and labor from the community. The management of water became a central aspect of daily life, intertwining survival with cooperation and governance. As settlements grew, the relationship between people and rivers expanded beyond agriculture. The Tigris and Euphrates provided natural routes for transport and trade. Boats, simple at first but gradually more sophisticated, allowed the movement of goods, people, and ideas. Grain, textiles, pottery, and metals could travel from one city to another, fostering connections between communities that might otherwise have remained isolated. Trade along the rivers not only facilitated economic growth, but also cultural exchange, as merchants brought stories, technologies, and customs from distant lands. Daily life along the rivers was rhythmically tied to natural cycles. Sunrise marked the start of labor, with farmers tending to fields, herders guiding their flocks, and craftsmen working in workshops. Markets buzzed quietly, with exchanges of food and goods, while temples held ceremonies that aligned with seasonal and religious calendars. Children learned early about the environment around them, observing the birds, the fish, and the patterns of the river. Skills such as navigation, farming, and craft work were passed down through generations, ensuring that knowledge was preserved even as circumstances changed. Religion and belief were deeply intertwined with life along the rivers. The Sumerians viewed the waters not merely as natural phenomena, but as manifestations of divine will. Rivers were sacred, their flows controlled by gods and goddesses who demanded respect and appeasement. Rituals and offerings were conducted at the riverbanks to ensure that floods would not be destructive. Crops would grow, and the community would thrive. The line between practical action and spiritual observance was blurred. Maintaining irrigation canals was both a necessity and a devotion, a means of honoring the forces that governed survival. In addition to the spiritual dimension, the rivers shaped social and political structures. Communities had to coordinate large-scale labor for canal construction and maintenance. These projects required leaders to organize workforces, resolve disputes, and allocate resources. Such coordination laid the groundwork for governance systems that extended beyond family units or small villages. Over time, city-states emerged, each with its own ruling council or king, responsible for both the practical management of the land and the spiritual well-being of its people. The rivers were at the center of this dual responsibility, linking human organization with natural and divine order. The Tigris and Euphrates also influenced technological innovation. The challenges of agriculture in a fluctuating environment inspired inventions that would have far-reaching consequences. Plows, irrigation mechanisms, storage silos, and water-lifting devices allowed farmers to increase yields and store surplus crops. Mathematics and measurement emerged as practical necessities. Fields had to be surveyed, canals measured, and grain accounted for. These advancements, though born from the humble need to survive, laid the foundation for more complex knowledge in engineering, astronomy, and administration. Trade along the rivers created social stratification. As merchants accumulated wealth, new classes of society began to emerge. Some individuals controlled land and water resources, while others specialized in crafts or trade. This stratification did not happen overnight, but developed gradually as communities expanded and interactions with neighboring regions increased. Wealth was not merely material. It also conferred status, influence, and access to religious or political power. The river, in effect, became a conduit for both economic and social currents, shaping the structure of Sumerian civilization at every level. Life along the rivers was also marked by art, culture, and storytelling. Sumerians carved scenes of river life into clay tablets, depicting farming and rituals. Music and dance were part of communal celebrations, often held near temples or along canals. The rivers themselves featured in myths and legends, as the Sumerians sought to explain their origins, the dangers they posed, and the abundance they provided. These stories were not idle entertainment. They were tools for transmitting knowledge, ethics, and cultural identity from one generation to the next. The unpredictability of the rivers fostered resilience and adaptability. Floods could wash away entire harvests, but communities learned to respond, rebuild, and innovate. Surplus food stored in granaries helped buffer against bad years, while social cohesion ensured that resources were shared and labor coordinated. Over time, this experience created a people who were both cautious and inventive, acutely aware of nature's power, yet confident in their ability to manipulate it. Survival required foresight, cooperation, and skill traits that would define the Sumerians for centuries. Environmental observation became a crucial aspect of daily life. Farmers and priests alike monitored seasonal changes, rainfall patterns, and the behavior of the rivers. Calendars were developed to predict planting and harvesting times. Astronomy, initially rooted in practical necessity, evolved into a sophisticated understanding of celestial patterns that influenced both agriculture and religious practice. This careful attention to the environment fostered a culture in which knowledge, observation, and ritual were closely linked, a culture that recognized the interconnectedness of human life and natural forces. Life along the Tigris and Euphrates was therefore more than subsistence. It was a continuous negotiation between humanity and nature. The rivers provided food, transport, and inspiration, but they also demanded respect, vigilance, and planning. In this delicate balance, early Sumerians learned lessons about collaboration, governance, innovation, and the limitations of human control. Their experiences would ripple forward in time, informing not only subsequent Mesopotamian cultures, but also the very concept of what it means to live in a structured society. Even in the quieter, seemingly mundane aspects of river life, there was significance. Maintaining canals, observing water levels, distributing food, or performing rituals were acts that reinforced social bonds and shared responsibility. Children learned these practices through participation and observation, absorbing knowledge that combined practical skills with cultural values. The daily rhythms of river life, though repetitive and slow by modern standards, cultivated a stable society capable of achieving remarkable developments in writing, mathematics, architecture, and governance. Trade, technology, and spirituality all converged along the rivers. Boats carried not only goods, but ideas. Temples served as centers of both faith and economic management. Festivals synchronized agricultural cycles with social cohesion. Life along the Tigris and Euphrates was a continuous interplay of human ingenuity, environmental awareness, and divine reverence. It was in this setting that the Sumerians first explored the possibilities of organized society on a scale that would shape the trajectory of civilization for millennia. The Sumerian experience teaches that civilization is not simply the result of great individuals or sudden invention. It is the accumulation of countless small decisions, laborious work, careful observation, and cooperation. Along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, humanity learned to live together, to respect the forces around them, and to build systems that could endure. The rivers shaped not only the land, but the people themselves, molding character, social structures, and the very way knowledge was created and preserved. And so, life along the Tigris and Euphrates becomes more than a historical curiosity. It is a lesson in the interdependence of environment and society, a demonstration of human resilience, and a prelude to the larger innovations that Sumer would contribute to the world. The rivers, winding and unpredictable, were at once challenge and opportunity, shaping the destiny of those who lived in their shadow and leaving. Early cities and social organization as small farming villages along the Tigris and Euphrates expanded. A remarkable transformation began to unfold. The scattered settlements that had once focused solely on subsistence gradually merged into larger, organized communities, giving birth to some of the earliest known cities in human history. Cities such as Uruk, Eridu, and Yor were not merely aggregations of houses. They were living systems, carefully structured to support both the practical needs of their inhabitants and the social and spiritual order that defined Sumerian life. The growth of these early cities was closely linked to the agricultural surpluses that the rivers made possible. When farmers could produce more grain than was immediately needed for survival, it created opportunities for specialization. Not everyone had to farm. Some individuals could dedicate themselves to craft work, such as pottery, weaving, or others focused on trade, acting as intermediaries between city-states and distant regions. This division of labor required a level of social organization that had previously been unnecessary in smaller, self-sufficient villages. Urban planning was often pragmatic, but also deeply symbolic. Streets were laid out to connect homes with marketplaces, temples, and communal spaces. Houses were typically constructed from mud bricks, designed to provide shelter from the heat of the Mesopotamian sun, while courtyards offered areas for family and community activities. Public spaces, although simple by modern standards, served as centers for trade, meetings, and religious ceremonies. The arrangement of cities reflected an awareness of both practical needs and social hierarchies, signaling the emergence of a civilization increasingly conscious of structure and order. Governance evolved alongside urban growth. In early cities, leaders were often chosen for their ability to manage resources, coordinate labor, and maintain social cohesion. These figures, sometimes called lugal, or big man, were responsible for ensuring that irrigation canals were maintained, that agricultural production met the needs of the community, and that trade was organized efficiently. Over time, these practical leaders evolved into monarchs, whose authority was often justified by claims of divine sanction. Temples, large communal structures often dominating the city skyline, became both religious centers and administrative hubs, reinforcing the connection between governance and spirituality. Religion played a central role in the organization of cities. Each city-state typically had a patron deity, a god or goddess whose favor was believed essential for the community's prosperity. Temples dedicated to these deities were not merely places of worship. They functioned as economic centers, managing land, labor, and resources. Priests and priestesses oversaw these operations, blending spiritual guidance with practical administration. Their dual role ensured that religious observance and civic duty were intertwined, making devotion a part of everyday life. Social organization extended beyond governance and religion into the daily rhythms of urban life. Families were typically extended, with multiple generations living under one roof or in close proximity. Households were units of production as well as domestic life. Women often managed kitchens, textiles, and domestic crafts, while men tended to fields, herds, or trade. Children learned from observing and participating in these activities, gradually acquiring the skills and knowledge necessary for adulthood. Apprenticeships in craft work, merchant activities, and temple duties ensured that skills were passed down and that the city's economy and cultural traditions remained resilient. Markets were central to the life of the city. Goods from local farms, craftspeople, and distant trade partners converged in public spaces where exchange was carefully regulated. Measures of grain, clay, metal, and textiles were standardized to facilitate fair trade, and scribes often recorded transactions on clay tablets to maintain accurate accounts. These records not only served practical purposes, but also became part of the historical record, offering modern scholars a window into the complexities of urban life thousands of years ago. Social stratification became increasingly evident as cities grew. Not all residents shared equal wealth, status, or influence. At the top were the rulers, priests, and wealthy merchants who controlled land, trade, and resources. Artisans, laborers, and farmers formed the backbone of the economy, performing essential work that supported the city's functioning. Slaves, often prisoners of war or individuals in debt, provided additional labor, though they were not the majority of the population. Despite these divisions, urban life depended on cooperation. Canals had to be maintained, food distributed, and markets managed. Hierarchies existed, but they were functional as well as symbolic, structuring society to ensure survival and prosperity. Early cities also fostered cultural development. Writing, first used to track economic transactions, quickly expanded into other domains. Religious texts, administrative records, and literary works were inscribed on clay tablets, enabling knowledge to accumulate and persist across generations. Artisans created decorative objects, sculptures, and seals that reflected both utility and aesthetic sensibility. Music and poetry, often performed during religious festivals, added layers of meaning to communal life. These cultural expressions were intertwined with the social fabric, reinforcing shared values, norms, and identities. Urban centers were hubs of innovation, not only culturally, but technologically. The challenges of city life, managing resources, coordinating labor, and navigating social complexity, encouraged the development of new tools, construction techniques, and systems of measurement. Standardized weights and measures facilitated trade and taxation. Architectural innovations, such as multi-room houses and stepped ziggurats, demonstrated advanced engineering skills. Even the earliest legal codes, which emerged in these cities, reflected attempts to codify expectations, resolve disputes, and maintain social order. Education and literacy became increasingly important. The demand for scribes, individuals trained to read, write, and record information, grew as cities expanded. Scribes were trained in special schools, learning cuneiform, mathematics, and administrative practices. Their role was vital for the functioning of the city, as they documented land ownership, trade transactions, tax obligations, and legal decisions. In effect, the ability to record and preserve information became a form of power, influencing governance, economy, and culture. Despite the apparent stability of urban life, early cities were never isolated from environmental or external pressures. Floods could devastate farmland. Droughts threatened food supplies. Rival city-states sometimes engaged in conflict. The need to respond to these challenges reinforced the importance of leadership, planning, and collaboration. Defense mechanisms, from city walls to strategic alliances, became part of the urban landscape, shaping not only the physical layout but also the social dynamics of the city. The emergence of cities transformed the way Sumerians perceived themselves and their communities. Individuals were no longer solely members of extended families or villages. They were citizens, contributing to the functioning of a larger society. Civic identity, tied to both the city and its patron deity, became a central aspect of personal and collective life. Rituals, festivals, and public gatherings reinforced this identity, blending religious devotion, cultural expression, and social cohesion. Early cities also facilitated interaction and exchange with distant regions. Trade networks extended beyond Mesopotamia, connecting cities to regions rich in stone, timber, metals, and luxury goods. This exchange was not purely economic. It carried ideas, technologies, and religious concepts. Through trade, Sumerians gained knowledge of distant lands, and their innovations, such as writing, irrigation techniques, and urban planning, would influence neighboring cultures. cities became nodes in an emerging network of human interaction, linking the local with the regional and, eventually, with the broader world. Within the city, the lives of ordinary people were shaped by a balance of necessity, opportunity, and tradition. Farmers, artisans, merchants, and priests navigated daily routines defined by labor, social expectations, and religious obligations. Festivals and rituals punctuated these routines, offering moments of reflection, celebration, and communal participation. The repetition of daily tasks, though seemingly mundane, maintained the structural integrity of the urban system and ensured continuity in social and economic life. In sum, the earliest cities of Sumer were remarkable not for their size alone, but for the intricate systems of organization they embodied. They represent humanity's first large-scale experiments in urban living, governance, specialization, and cultural development. Each city was a microcosm of society, blending practical problem-solving with spiritual and cultural expression. In these urban centers, the foundations of civilization, administration, law, trade, art, and social hierarchy were established, setting patterns that would endure in human societies for millennia. The study of early Sumerian cities provides insight not only into how humans organize themselves but also into the principles that underpin successful societies: cooperation, adaptability, and the integration of labor, governance, and culture. In observing these first cities, one sees the gradual emergence of a social consciousness, a recognition that survival and prosperity depend on both collective action. The invention of writing, cuneiform, among the many innovations that distinguish the Sumerians. Perhaps none is as significant or enduring as the invention of writing. In the early centuries of Mesopotamian civilization, as villages grew into bustling cities, the practical demands of administration, trade, and record-keeping gave rise to a profound human breakthrough: the ability to encode information in a permanent, legible form. This innovation, known today as cuneiform, represents the first known writing system in human history, and its creation marked a turning point not only for Sumer, but for humanity as a whole. The origins of cuneiform were rooted in necessity, as early farmers along the Tigris and Euphrates began producing surpluses of grain. Managing resources became increasingly complex. It was no longer enough to rely on memory or verbal agreements. The growing volume of trade, taxation, and labor required accurate records. Initially, simple clay tokens represented quantities of goods such as grain, sheep, or oil. Each shape and size conveyed specific information, functioning as a primitive system of accounting. These tokens were stored in clay envelopes, or bulla, to prevent tampering, effectively creating early contracts that recorded transactions in a tangible form. Over time, these tokens evolved into pictographs, simplified images impressed onto flat clay tablets. Each symbol represented an object, quantity, or idea, allowing for more sophisticated record keeping. For instance, a drawing of a head of cattle could indicate a single animal, or, with the addition of numerical marks, a herd of 50. This development was incremental. It required careful observation, experimentation, and adaptation. Early scribes, often young apprentices, honed their skills over years, learning the precise shapes, marks, and conventions necessary to communicate reliably through symbols. The transition from to cuneiform system of wedge-shaped marks made by pressing a red stylus into soft clay was a pivotal moment. The stylus produced standardized impressions that could be replicated, creating a consistent writing method that could be taught and transmitted. Cuneiform was not a language in the modern sense at first, but a system of signs that conveyed meaning, numbers, and transactions. Its flexibility allowed Sumerians to record both concrete data, like the number of sheep or jars of oil, and more abstract concepts, such as ownership, debt, or labor obligations. Clay tablets, once dried or baked, provided a durable medium, capable of preserving information for centuries. Unlike perishable materials such as papyrus or parchment, clay could withstand the test of time, which is why archaeologists today can study Sumerian records thousands of years later. These tablets contain evidence of daily life, legal codes, trade agreements, and religious offerings. They reveal not only the practical needs of a civilization, but also its intellectual ambitions, the desire to communicate, organize, and preserve knowledge across generations. Scribes held a position of immense importance in Sumerian society. Training to become a scribe was a rigorous process, often beginning in childhood. Students learned to read and write cuneiform, memorize symbols, and perform calculations. They were responsible for documenting transactions, maintaining administrative records, and sometimes composing hymns, myths, or historical accounts. Their work was meticulous, requiring precision and attention to detail. In effect, scribes were the keepers of memory, ensuring that the activities of the city, the rulings of leaders, and the offerings to the gods were accurately recorded and preserved. The impact of writing extended far beyond administration. Cuneiform became a tool for cultural expression, allowing Sumerians to compose literature, myths, and hymns that conveyed moral lessons, religious beliefs, and shared cultural narratives. Epic tales, such as the later Epic of Gilgamesh, illustrate how writing transformed oral tradition into a permanent form, enabling stories to survive long after the events and people they described had passed. Writing allowed for reflection, planning, and communication on a scale that memory alone could not support. Cuneiform also facilitated the standardization of knowledge. Weights, measures, and codes of law could be recorded and disseminated consistently, reducing ambiguity and promoting fairness in trade and governance. For instance, the careful documentation of grain allocations, labor obligations, and tax assessments helped maintain social order in rapidly growing cities. The act of writing created a shared framework of understanding that linked the abstract concept of authority to tangible, reproducible records. The versatility of cuneiform enabled its use across multiple domains. Economic records, such as lists of commodities, trade receipts, and receipts for loans, coexisted with astronomical observations, medicinal recipes, and engineering instructions. This breadth of application underscores the ingenuity of the Sumerians in recognizing that writing could serve not just practical needs, but also intellectual and spiritual pursuits. The written word became a medium through which knowledge could be accumulated, analyzed, and transmitted beyond immediate experience. Education in writing was closely tied to social mobility. Individuals who mastered cuneiform could occupy prestigious positions in administration, temple management, or commerce. Literacy was a form of power, providing access to information and discipline. It also offered a measure of security and respect, as literate individuals were essential to the functioning of cities, temples, and trade networks. In this sense, the invention of writing created new pathways for social organization, linking technical skill to influence and responsibility. Cuneiform's adaptability contributed to its longevity, while originally developed to record Sumerian The system was later adapted to other languages across Mesopotamia, including Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian. This adaptability demonstrates both the robustness of the writing system and the cultural influence of Sumer. Writing allowed ideas, records, and administrative techniques to spread far beyond their point of origin, contributing to a shared framework of civilization across a region. The creation of writing also reshaped human perception of time and memory. Whereas oral traditions relied on repetition and personal recollection, written records could endure, providing continuity across generations. Decisions, agreements, and historical events could be documented with precision, preserving knowledge that would otherwise be vulnerable to distortion or loss. In this way, cuneiform allowed Sumerians to engage with history, planning, and governance in ways that were previously unimaginable. Religious and mythological texts, written in cuneiform, offer insight into the Sumerians' worldview. Hymns to God's temple inventories and ritual instructions demonstrate how writing bridged the practical and the spiritual. Temples maintained detailed records of offerings, festivals, and sacrifices, ensuring that obligations to the divine were met consistently. In effect, writing allowed the Sumerians to formalize and perpetuate their relationship with the sacred, embedding spirituality within the structured life of the city. Cuneiform also provided a framework for legal systems, the codification of rules, obligations, and punishments on clay tablets created a shared reference for justice and governance. Legal tablets preserved agreements between individuals, documented debts, and outlined responsibilities, offering both protection and accountability. This written law strengthened social cohesion by providing clarity and consistency, reinforcing the idea that the functioning of society depended on adherence to established norms recorded in writing. The influence of writing extended into economic innovation. Merchants could record transactions, track inventory, and calculate profits with precision. Farmers could document harvests, store records of allocations, and manage labor effectively. The ability to quantify and record economic activity facilitated more complex trade networks, both within cities and with distant regions. Writing became an indispensable tool for organizing the economy, linking human effort to material resources through a reliable, permanent medium. Beyond its functional utility, the invention of writing represents a profound cognitive achievement. The abstract act of encoding speech and concepts into permanent symbols reflects a capacity for symbolic thought and long-term planning. Writing enabled Sumerians to conceptualize information in new ways, think critically about society, and preserve knowledge beyond the immediate demands of daily life. This cognitive leap set the stage for subsequent developments in literature, science, philosophy, and administration. In essence, cuneiform was not merely a method of communication. It was a transformative technology that reshaped Sumerian civilization. It allowed humans to manage complex societies, transmit culture, and record the ephemeral aspects of daily life. The written word made history tangible, turning transient events into enduring knowledge. The invention of writing is a testament to human ingenuity, a bridge between practical necessity and intellectual aspiration that would shape the trajectory of civilization for millennia. The study of cuneiform tablets today reveals a world of astonishing complexity, from mundane lists of grain deliveries to intricate hymns to the gods. These artifacts illuminate the lives of individuals, the organization of cities, and the intellectual ambitions of a society thousands of years old. In cuneiform, we witness the emergence of a human capacity to document, analyze, and reflect the capacity that continues to define temples, ziggurats, and religious life among the most striking features of early Sumerian cities were their temples and grand structures that dominated the skyline and embodied both religious devotion and civic authority. These buildings were far more than architectural feats. They were centers of social, economic, and spiritual life. The Sumerians believed that gods and goddesses actively shaped their world, and temples served as the vital points of contact between humans and the divine. To understand Sumerian civilization, one must appreciate the central role that religious life and its monumental architecture played in everyday existence. Temples were the heart of each city-state, dedicated to the city's patron deity. Eridu, for instance, was associated with Enki, the god of wisdom and water, while Uruk honored Inanna, the goddess of love and war. These temples were not simply places of worship. They were complex institutions that oversaw agricultural production, managed estates, collected taxes, and coordinated labor for public works. Priests and priestesses, often highly educated in the arts of writing and mathematics, administered these operations. The temple thus became an intersection of the spiritual and the practical, where devotion and daily governance intertwined. The most visually imposing of these structures were stepped pyramids built to elevate the temple closer to the heavens. Constructed from mud brick and often faced with baked brick, ziggurats were massive undertakings requiring enormous labor and resources. Their design symbolized a bridge between a human and divine realms, a tangible representation of the city's commitment to the gods. Access to the top was typically restricted to priests, and rituals performed there reinforced the perceived favor of the deity and the social order of the city. In a society deeply concerned with divine approval, the ziggurat was both a spiritual focal point and a statement of civic ambition. Religious life permeated every aspect of Sumerian society. Festivals, ceremonies, and daily rituals marked the passage of time, agricultural cycles, and significant communal events. Offerings of food, drink, and precious objects were common, as were prayers and invocations for protection, prosperity, and guidance. Religious observances were not optional. They were integrated into civic responsibility. Temple officials ensured that rituals were performed correctly, understanding that neglect could invite divine displeasure, which might manifest in crop failure, flooding, or disease. The structure of religious life thus reinforced the social fabric and maintained order within the city. The priests and priestesses who oversaw these religious institutions were influential figures. Their duties extended beyond ritual performance to include land management and the coordination of labor for large construction projects. In many cases, the temple itself was a major economic center, controlling agricultural estates, herds, and workshops. This concentration of spiritual, economic, and administrative authority made the clergy a powerful class within Sumerian cities. Their guidance shaped civic life, influencing everything from trade to education to dispute resolution. Religious narratives, recorded on cuneiform tablets, reveal a worldview in which humans and gods were deeply interconnected. Myths explained natural phenomena, social hierarchies, and ethical norms. Stories of creation, floods, and heroic deeds provided a moral and cosmological framework for understanding the world. The divine realm was populated with personalities and conflicts, mirroring human society in complexity and emotion. By engaging with these myths through ritual and education, Sumerians internalized the values, fears, and aspirations of their culture. Temples also functioned as educational centers. Young scribes learned to read and write in the service of the gods, copying hymns, prayers, and administrative records under the supervision of senior priests. This education was meticulous, blending literacy, numeracy, and religious instruction. It ensured continuity, as each generation of scribes preserved and transmitted both practical knowledge and spiritual traditions. In this way, temples served not only the immediate religious needs of the city, but also the long-term intellectual and cultural development of Sumerian society. Religious life extended into the home and community as well. Household shrines and small offerings ensured that divine presence was acknowledged daily, not only at grand temples. Ordinary people engaged in prayers and rituals that connected them to the cycles of nature and to their city's broader spiritual life. Festivals marked significant agricultural events, such as planting and harvest, linking religious observance with practical survival. In doing so, Sumerians cultivated a worldview in which human activity and divine favor were inseparable. The construction and maintenance of temples and ziggurats also reflect the social and organizational capabilities of early Sumer. These monumental projects required coordinated labor, material procurement, and careful planning. Workers were often organized into teams, performing specialized tasks such as brickmaking, transportation, and construction. The process of building a ziggurat or temple demonstrated the society's ability to mobilize collective effort toward a shared long-term goal, reinforcing both social cohesion and the authority of the ruling and priestly classes. Artistic expression was closely tied to religious life. Temples were adorned with reliefs, statues, and inscriptions that depicted gods, humans, and mythological narratives. These artworks were not merely decorative. They communicated religious teachings, cultural values, and political legitimacy. The careful craftsmanship evident in temple art illustrates a society deeply invested in the visual representation of belief, a belief system that permeated the physical and spiritual landscape alike. Rituals at temples were highly structured. Daily offerings ensured that deities were honored consistently, while annual festivals celebrated seasonal changes or mythological events. Music, dance, and performance played key roles, creating immersive experiences that reinforced communal identity. The sensory richness of these ceremonies, from the smell of incense to the sound of drums and lyresome participants in a carefully orchestrated expression of devotion. Through repeated participation, individuals internalized the values and narratives central to their society. Religious authority also intersected with governance. Kings often claimed divine favor or even partial divinity, legitimizing their rule through association with temple deities. Temples advised rulers, mediated disputes, and oversaw public works projects. In some cases, kings themselves participated in ritual, reinforcing the connection between civic and spiritual authority. This intertwining of political and religious structures ensured that both realms reinforced each other, creating a coherent societal framework in which obedience and piety were mutually reinforcing. The economic dimension of religious life was substantial. Temples controlled vast tracts of land, managed granaries, and employed large numbers of laborers. Agricultural surpluses supported temple activities and facilitated offerings to the gods. These resources also enabled temples to act as centers of redistribution, supplying food and goods to the community, supporting festivals, and providing for those in need. The management of these resources required sophisticated record-keeping and administrative oversight, tasks that further integrated religious and civic functions. Sumerian cosmology. as expressed through temple practice and mythology, emphasized balance, order, and the interdependence of humans and the divine. Humans were seen as stewards of the land and participants in a cosmic order maintained by gods. Temples, ziggurats, and ritual observances were mechanisms through which this order was enacted and reinforced. By participating in religious life, individuals contributed to societal stability while aligning themselves with a broader cosmic framework. Religious life also influenced legal and moral norms. Laws often reflected divine expectations, and disputes were sometimes adjudicated with reference to religious principles. Ethical behavior, social obligations, and civic duties were framed within a religious context, reinforcing the notion that human actions had both earthly and divine consequences. In this sense, temples functioned as moral as well as spiritual centers, guiding behavior and mediating conflicts in accordance with the perceived will of the gods. Through the careful coordination of labor, education, ritual, and art, temples and ziggurats exemplified the integration of multiple aspects of Sumerian life. They were centers of administration, culture, and spirituality, reflecting a society capable of organizing itself on a scale unprecedented in human history. The monumental architecture of ziggurats stood as a physical reminder of human ambition and devotion, bridging the earthly and the divine. In summary, the temples, and religious practices of Sumer were more than expressions of belief. They were the very backbone of city life. They structured social hierarchies, facilitated economic and administrative management, and provided education and cultural continuity. Religious life in Sumer was inseparable from governance, economy, and daily existence, shaping not only how people worshipped, but how they lived, worked, and interacted. The careful balance of devotion, administration, and communal effort ensured that these early cities could thrive in a challenging environment, leaving a legacy that continues to fascinate scholars and observers today. Kings and governance in Sumeraz. The Sumerian cities expanded. The complexity of urban life necessitated increasingly sophisticated systems of governance. The early city-states, with their growing populations, surplus production, and intricate trade networks, could no longer rely solely on communal decision-making or informal leadership. Out of this need arose the office of King Shipan institution that blended political, military, and religious authority. The rulers of Sumer were more than administrators. They were the linchpins of society, responsible for coordinating labor, maintaining justice, and ensuring the favor of the gods. In the earliest stages of kingship, leaders were often chosen based on merit or skill. These big men, known as Lugals in Sumerian, gained authority by demonstrating their ability to manage irrigation systems, organize communal labor, and protect their people. Leadership was practical, rooted in competence rather than heredity. Over time, however, kingship became more formalized, often hereditary, and closely tied to religious legitimacy. A king was not merely a secular ruler. He was the representative of a god on earth, a conduit through which divine will was enacted. This dual role of political and religious authority strengthened the position of the king, making him central to the functioning of the city-state. Sumerian. Kings bore the responsibility of maintaining both internal stability and external security. Within the city, they oversaw agricultural production, trade, and infrastructure projects such as canals, roads, and walls. Beyond the city, they commanded armies to defend against rivals and secure borders. Military leadership was a crucial aspect of kingship, as city-states frequently competed for land, water, and trade routes. The capacity to protect resources and people directly influenced a king's legitimacy, while victories in battle often reinforced his divine favor and prestige. Governance, in Sumer, was closely intertwined with religion. Kings performed ceremonial duties at temples, participated in festivals, and made offerings to gods, reinforcing the belief that their authority was sanctioned by divine powers. This connection between spiritual and political authority ensured that obedience to the king was not only a civic duty, but also a moral and religious expectation. By aligning governance with divine will, Sumerian rulers were able to consolidate power, regulate society, and mediate conflicts with the authority of the gods behind them. The administration of the city-state was highly organized. Scribes and officials documented land ownership, taxation, trade, and legal matters, maintaining a comprehensive record of civic activity. These bureaucratic systems required literacy, numerical skills, and specialized knowledge, all of which were fostered by temples and educational institutions. The king relied on these trained administrators to implement policies, collect revenues, and ensure that laws were enforced fairly and consistently. In this way, governance was both hierarchical and systematic, linking the monarch to a broader network of functionaries who maintained social order. Legal codes, often associated with kings, were central to governance, while the most famous example, the Code of Hammurabi, emerged centuries later. Earlier Sumerian rulers also established written laws to regulate property, trade, family relations, and criminal behavior. These laws formalized expectations, provided mechanisms for resolving disputes, and reinforced the king's authority as the ultimate arbiter of justice. By codifying rules, Sumerian kings could standardize behavior, reduce conflicts, and legitimize their decisions as expressions of both law and divine will. Kingship was not merely administrative. It also required diplomatic skill. City-states engaged in treaties, alliances, and negotiations to secure trade routes, prevent warfare, and foster cooperation. Envoys, often accompanied by gifts or tribute, facilitated communication between rulers and neighboring states. Diplomacy, like warfare, was an essential aspect of a king's responsibilities, and the ability to navigate complex relationships could determine the prosperity and survival of a city-state. Successful kings balanced negotiation with military readiness, maintaining both stability and flexibility in an unpredictable landscape. Public works projects were another critical responsibility of Sumerian rulers. Canals, levees, temples, ziggurats, and defensive walls were all constructed under the supervision of the king. These projects required careful planning, coordination of labor, and resource allocation. Large portions of the population, including farmers and laborers, were mobilized for construction, often as part of civic or religious duty. Through these efforts, kings not only ensured the functionality and protection of the city, but also demonstrated their leadership, vision, and commitment to the welfare of their people. Economic oversight was also central to kingship. Kings controlled land distribution, trade regulations, taxation, and resource management. Granaries stored surpluses and collected taxes allowed rulers to stabilize the economy, provide for the population during shortages, and fund public projects. Merchants and artisans were subject to regulation and documentation, ensuring transparency and fairness in commerce. By managing economic activity effectively, kings reinforced their authority and contributed to the prosperity and sustainability of the city-state. The personal life of kings was often a reflection of their public role. Royal households were centers of power, wealth, and ceremonial activity. Kings participated in rituals that symbolized their connection to the gods and their role as protectors of the city. Marriages were frequently strategic, forging alliances with influential families or neighboring states. Royal patronage of arts, literature, and architecture further reinforced the king's prestige, projecting power and piety to both subjects and rivals. In this sense, the king's private and public spheres were intertwined, each reinforcing the other. Kings were also central figures in Sumerian mythology and historical memory. Lists of kings, preserved on cuneiform tablets, often included legendary figures whose reigns lasted for improbably long periods. These records served both to legitimize contemporary rulers and to preserve a sense of historical continuity by linking current governance to the deeds of legendary kings. Sumerian city-states reinforced the idea that authority was both timeless and divinely sanctioned. Myth and history merged to strengthen the social and political fabric. Military campaigns were crucial to asserting and maintaining kingship. Control over land and water resources, access to trade routes, and defense against hostile neighbors required organized and disciplined forces. Kings led armies personally, and victories were celebrated as evidence of both military skill and divine favor. Defeated rivals were often integrated into the kingdom or subjugated, reinforcing the king's authority and expanding the influence of the city-state. These military activities, while disruptive, were integral to the survival and prosperity of Sumerian rulers and their populations. Kingship also involved managing succession and legitimacy. The hereditary principle became increasingly common, though rulers were expected to demonstrate competence and maintain the favor of both gods and citizens. Dynastic continuity provided stability, ensuring that governance structures, religious rituals, and economic systems remained functional across generations. At the same time, succession disputes sometimes led to conflict, highlighting the delicate balance between inheritance, merit, and political stability. The ceremonial aspects of kingship were closely tied to public perception. Coronation rituals, temple offerings, and festivals emphasized the king's role as intermediary between the divine and human realms. These ceremonies reinforced social hierarchies, celebrated civic cohesion, and projected power both internally and externally. Public participation in these rituals helped legitimize authority and instill a sense of shared responsibility for the welfare and prosperity of the city. Kings also acted as patrons of knowledge and culture. Under their reign, scribes recorded administrative, legal, and literary texts. Temples and educational institutions thrived, preserving scientific, religious, and mathematical knowledge. Architectural projects, from ziggurats to palaces, reflected both aesthetic vision and functional planning. Through these activities, kings shaped the intellectual and cultural trajectory of their society, leaving a lasting imprint on the Sumerian legacy. The role of kings in Sumerian governance was thus multifaceted. Political leaders, military commanders, religious intermediaries, economic overseers, and cultural patrons. Their authority was rooted in practical skill, strategic vision, religious legitimacy, and the ability to mobilize the population for collective purposes. Kingship provided the structure necessary for urban life to flourish, creating stability in a complex and often unpredictable environment. Sumerian governance demonstrates that early civilizations were capable of sophisticated administrative, economic, and social organization. The integration of political, religious, and economic authority under the king allowed cities to manage labor, resources, and knowledge effectively. Kings were central to this system, coordinating the many facets of urban life while embodying the connection between the human and divine. Their leadership set patterns of governance that would influence Mesopotamia for centuries and provide models for subsequent civilizations. Ultimately, the kings of Sumer were more than rulers. They were organizers of society, stewards of the land. Daily life, farming, trade, and craftsmanship for the vast majority of Sumerians. Life revolved around the practical necessities of daily survival, while kings, priests, and scribes occupied positions of influence and authority. The foundation of Sumerian civilization rested on the steady labor of farmers, merchants, and artisans. Understanding their daily routines offers a glimpse into the rhythms of life that sustained some of the earliest cities in human history, where agriculture, trade, and craftsmanship intertwined to form the backbone of society. Farming was at the heart of daily existence. The fertile alluvial plains of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers provided the ideal conditions for cultivating barley, wheat, dates, and vegetables. Farmers worked in small plots of land that had been allocated to their families, tending crops with simple tools such as wooden plows, sickles, and digging sticks. The work was strenuous and required careful attention to the rhythms of the seasons, irrigation cycles, and the unpredictable behavior of the rivers. Planting and harvesting were communal efforts, with neighbors often assisting each other to ensure timely completion. Irrigation was essential to successful agriculture. Farmers maintained canals, dikes, and reservoirs, channeling water from the rivers to their fields. The management of irrigation systems demanded both technical knowledge and coordination, as disruptions could threaten an entire harvest. Seasonal flooding could enrich the soil, but excessive water could destroy crops. Farmers learned to read the patterns of the rivers and adjust their practices accordingly. The dependence on irrigation fostered a culture of collaboration, as communities pooled labor and resources to maintain the necessary infrastructure for survival. Livestock also played a crucial role in Sumerian agriculture. Sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs were raised for meat, milk, leather, and wool. Herding required constant attention, as animals needed grazing, land, water, and protection from predators. Animals were also used as draft animals to plow fields and transport goods, enhancing agricultural efficiency. The care and management of livestock were responsibilities that often fell to men, though women and children frequently assisted, particularly in tasks related to milking, shearing, and processing animal products. Trade emerged naturally from agricultural surplus. Once families produced more food than they required for immediate consumption, they could exchange it for goods they could not produce themselves. Markets, often held in public spaces within the city, were lively centers where grain, livestock, textiles, pottery, and crafted goods were exchanged. Merchants, skilled in negotiation and record keeping, played a key role in facilitating these exchanges, linking individual producers to broader economic networks. The existence of trade allowed cities to thrive, promoting specialization and providing incentives for innovation in both production and commerce. Craftsmanship was another essential aspect of daily life. Artisans produced a wide variety of goods, from pottery and textiles to metal tools and jewelry. These crafts required training, skill, and attention to detail. Pottery workshops created vessels for storing food and water, while weavers transformed wool and flax into clothing and textiles. Metalworkers fashioned tools, weapons, and ornamental items, often working with imported copper or tin. The quality and durability of crafted goods influence both domestic life and trade, making artisans integral to the city's economic and social fabric. The organization of labor reflected both necessity and social structure. Families worked together, with tasks often divided by gender and age. Men typically handled fieldwork, construction, and heavy labor, while women managed domestic tasks, food preparation, weaving, and childcare. Children contributed from a young age, learning practical skills through observation and participation. This division of labor was pragmatic, ensuring that households could meet their needs efficiently while contributing to the larger economic system of the city. Markets were more than centers of economic activity. They were social hubs where news, information, and ideas circulated. Merchants and farmers gathered to exchange not only goods, but knowledge about trade routes, prices, and political developments. Social interactions at markets helped maintain cohesion within the city and provided opportunities for negotiation, alliance building, and dispute resolution. Market activity reinforced social hierarchies, as wealthier merchants and landowners often controlled access to valuable goods and resources, while smaller producers and traders navigated the system to meet their needs. Daily life was punctuated by the rhythms of work and ritual. Farmers and artisans timed their labor around the rising and setting of the sun, the movement of the rivers, and religious observances. Festivals, temple offerings, and communal ceremonies provided both spiritual enrichment and opportunities for social interaction. These events reinforced shared cultural values, connecting the practical aspects of life with a broader sense of purpose and belonging. Even in the routine work of planting, harvesting, crafting, or trading, religious and communal life was never far from awareness. Craft production often involved specialized knowledge passed down through apprenticeships. Young individuals trained under experienced artisans, learning techniques, measurements, and methods of quality control. Workshops might focus on a single craft or produce a variety of goods, and the organization of labor ensured efficiency and skill preservation. This system allowed for the accumulation of expertise over generations, fostering both economic stability and cultural continuity. Trade extended beyond city boundaries, linking Sumer to distant regions. Merchants transported surplus grain, textiles, pottery, and metal goods along rivers and overland routes, connecting with communities in neighboring regions. Imported materials such as timber, stone, and metals were critical to construction, craftsmanship, and technological development. Trade required careful negotiation, record keeping, and sometimes negotiation with rulers or temple authorities. Through commerce, Sumerian cities became interconnected, exchanging not only goods, but ideas, techniques, and cultural influences. The economic activity of daily life also depended on record keeping. Scribes documented transactions, tracked inventories, and recorded loans and debts on clay tablets. Literacy and numeracy were therefore essential to both merchants and city officials. These records allowed for accountability, facilitated complex exchanges, and provided a permanent record of economic activity. The ability to document transactions represented an early form of economic control, ensuring stability and transparency within the growing urban economy. Food, preparation, and consumption were central to domestic life. Meals were simple but varied, often including barley bread, vegetables, legumes, and occasionally meat or fish. Brewing beer from barley was a common practice, both for nutritional and social purposes. Household routines involved grinding grain, baking bread, cooking stews, and storing surplus in clay containers. The management of food resources was vital, as it supported both the household and the city's broader population during shortages or festivals. That housing reflected both function and social status. Most families lived in mud brick homes with flat roofs, providing shelter from the heat and seasonal rains. Houses included courtyards for work and social activities, storage areas for grain and tools, and rooms for sleeping. Larger households often included multiple generations and extended family members, creating a support network that facilitated labor, childcare, and resource management. The design of homes reflected the integration of daily life with environmental conditions, labor needs, and social organization. Crafts such as pottery, weaving, and metalwork were essential for both domestic use and trade. Pottery vessels stored food and water, while textiles provided clothing and trade commodities. Metal tools enhanced agricultural productivity, construction, and warfare. These crafts required attention to material quality, technique, and durability, reflecting the practical ingenuity of Sumerian society. Craft production also created social interdependence, as households relied on specialists for goods that they could not produce themselves. Workdays were long and demanding, yet structured around communal and religious norms. Labor was often interspersed with breaks for meals, water, and ritual observance. Communities recognized seasonal labor demands, with periods of intense activity during planting, irrigation, maintenance, and harvest. Collective labor was not only practical but social, reinforcing bonds within neighborhoods, villages, and city quarters. These rhythms of work, combined with religious and cultural observances, provided continuity and stability in the daily lives of Sumerians. In summary, the daily life of Sumerians encompassed a delicate balance of labor, trade, and cultural practice. Farmers, artisans, and merchants sustained the economy, supported urban growth, and enabled the specialization that characterized Sumerian civilization. Trade connected communities, craftsmanship provided essential goods, and structured labor reinforced social cohesion. Embedded within this framework were religious and cultural norms that gave meaning and continuity to everyday routines. Through careful management of agriculture, skillful trade, and dedicated craftsmanship, Sumerians created a society that was both resilient and innovative. Daily life was demanding, but it fostered cooperation, skill development, and cultural transmission. Education and scribes. The keepers of knowledge in Sumerian civilization, the written word was both a practical necessity and a symbol of power. The creation of cuneiform provided the tools for recording transactions, codifying laws, and preserving cultural narratives. But the ability to read and write was not widespread. Instead, literacy was concentrated in the hands of a specialized class, scribes. These individuals were the keepers of knowledge, the intermediaries between the ephemeral world of speech and the permanence of the written record, and they played an essential role in the functioning of Sumerian society. Becoming a scribe was a rigorous and disciplined process, often beginning in early childhood. Boys, usually from families of modest or elite status, were selected for their potential to master the complex symbols of cuneiform. They attended special schools called edibas, which were often associated with temples or palace complexes. In these institutions, students learned to inscribe clay tablets with wedge-shaped marks, mastering both the technical aspects of writing and the organizational structures of administration. The process required patience, precision, and repetition, as even small errors could alter the meaning of a record. The curriculum for scribes was comprehensive. Students studied not only the forms and meanings of hundreds of symbols, but also legal conventions and economic procedures. Mathematics was particularly important, as scribes frequently recorded quantities of grain, livestock, or trade goods. Exercises included calculating rations, measuring plots of land, and converting between units of volume and weight. Mastery of these skills allowed scribes to function as essential administrators, ensuring accuracy in trade, taxation, and record-keeping across the city-state. Scribes were intimately connected with temples, which served as centers of education and administration. Temple officials often supervised their training, teaching the young scribes to copy religious hymns, ritual instructions, and offerings. This dual role of scribes as both administrative professionals and custodians of sacred knowledge reflected the interconnectedness of religion, governance, and literacy in Sumerian life. By recording both the mundane and the sacred, scribes ensured that the operations of the city and the devotion to the gods were meticulously documented. The tools of the scribe were simple yet effective. A reed stylus was pressed into soft clay to create the characteristic wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform. Tablets varied in size depending on the purpose. Small tablets for daily accounts, medium-sized ones for legal records, and larger tablets for literary or administrative compositions. Once inscribed, tablets were often baked or dried to ensure permanence. In some cases, important records were stored in temple archives, creating repositories of knowledge that could be consulted for generations. Scribes held a position of considerable social importance. Their expertise made them indispensable to both civic and religious institutions. They documented trade agreements, land transactions, tax obligations, and legal disputes, providing an enduring record that ensured continuity and accountability. Beyond their administrative duties, scribes preserved cultural narratives, myths, and historical events. Through their work, they contributed to the intellectual and spiritual life of the city, ensuring that knowledge was not lost to memory or oral transmission alone. Education for scribes was demanding, reflecting the complexity of the written language. Students practiced by copying texts repeatedly, learning to balance precision with speed. They memorized signs, practiced calculations, and studied conventions for record-keeping. Mistakes were corrected rigorously, as accuracy was essential for both administrative integrity and religious fidelity. The process could take many years, but upon completion, a trained scribe possessed skills that conferred social mobility, professional security, and influence within the city. The work of scribes extended far beyond simple record-keeping. They were involved in compiling inventories, managing temple resources, coordinating labor, and overseeing legal documentation. Scribes could also serve as advisors, interpreting laws, calculating tax obligations, or drafting official correspondence. Their literacy allowed them to mediate between rulers, priests, merchants, and common citizens, making them vital intermediaries in the functioning of complex urban societies. Religious texts formed a significant part of the scribal tradition. Hymns, prayers, ritual instructions, and offerings were meticulously recorded on clay tablets. By preserving these texts, scribes ensured that religious practices could be performed consistently and correctly. Temples relied on these written records to maintain the favor of their patron deities, as errors or omissions in ritual observances were believed to have tangible consequences for the community. Scribes thus acted as guardians of spiritual as well as civic order. The preservation of knowledge extended to historical records. Scribes documented the reigns of kings, military campaigns, floods, famines, and other significant events. These records were more than administrative. They provided a collective memory for the city-state, linking past, present, and future. By recording events with careful attention to detail, scribes created a framework for understanding history, governance, and social responsibility, allowing societies to learn from precedent and maintain continuity across generations. Scribal literacy was also a vehicle for cultural transmission. Epic tales, myths, and instructional texts were copied and taught, ensuring that the values, beliefs, and intellectual achievements of Sumer were passed down. Literature, such as the stories that would later inspire the Epic of Gilgamesh, was preserved and disseminated by scribes, demonstrating that literacy was not merely functional, but also deeply connected to cultural identity. The ability to read and write became a conduit for both practical and intellectual life. Scribes worked in a hierarchical system that reflected the broader organization of Sumerian society. Senior scribes oversaw apprentices and junior scribes, assigning tasks, correcting errors, and maintaining the quality of records. This mentorship system ensured skill transmission and provided structure within the educational and administrative framework. In essence, scribes operated within a microcosm of society, replicating the hierarchies, responsibilities, and accountability mechanisms that characterized the larger city-state. The importance of scribes extended into economic life. They tracked goods, documented sales, calculated taxes, and monitored production. Accurate records allowed city-states to manage resources efficiently, maintain trade networks, and support public projects. Scribes' work was essential for preventing disputes and ensuring fairness in transactions, highlighting the interdependence of literacy, administration, and economic stability. Without scribes, the sophisticated urban and economic structures of Sumer would have been impossible to maintain. Scribal schools were often linked to social mobility. Literacy provided access to administrative roles, priestly functions, and opportunities for advancement within temples or palaces. The knowledge acquired through education allowed individuals to influence decision-making, manage resources, and participate in governance. In this way, the acquisition of writing skills created pathways for both personal and professional advancement, demonstrating that education was not merely intellectual, but also a practical instrument of social organization. The meticulous work of scribes also shaped scientific and mathematical development. Clay tablets contain calculations related to land measurement, accounting, and early astronomical observations. Scribes recorded patterns in the skies, seasonal cycles, and agricultural data, laying the groundwork for future advancements in mathematics, astronomy, and timekeeping. The ability to systematically record and analyze information allowed Sumerians to anticipate environmental changes, plan agricultural schedules, and develop complex administrative procedures. Cultural memory depended on the scribes' careful work. Myths, rituals, and historical accounts preserved on clay tablets ensured that knowledge could endure beyond the lifetime of any single generation. This permanence distinguished Sumerian civilization from societies that relied solely on oral tradition. By maintaining written records, scribes linked the past with the present, providing continuity, authority, and a shared cultural framework that strengthened both civic and religious institutions. Scribes were also instrumental in the legal system. They recorded contracts, property transactions, disputes, and court decisions. These records provided evidence, established precedents, and reinforced the rule of law. The written word became a mechanism for accountability, enabling rulers and officials to enforce justice consistently. Literacy in legal matters was a form of power, as it allowed scribes to influence decisions, mediate conflicts, and uphold the structure of the city-state. In summary, education and scribal work were foundational to the functioning of Sumerian society. Scribes preserved knowledge, facilitated administration, documented religious and civic life, and contributed to the intellectual and cultural development of the civilization. Their training, skill, and meticulous attention to detail made them indispensable intermediaries in the complex urban systems of early Mesopotamia. Through their work, Sumerians were able to maintain order, transmit knowledge, and create a legacy that continues to inform our understanding of human history. Mythology that shaped ancient beliefs in the heart of Sumerian civilization. Mythology served as both a reflection of human experience and a guiding framework for understanding the world. Myths were not mere stories. They were instructional, explanatory, and deeply intertwined with daily life. They offered explanations for natural phenomena, provided moral guidance, and legitimized social structures. For the ancient Sumerians, mythology was a bridge between the divine and human realms, shaping beliefs, rituals, and cultural identity in ways that would resonate across generations. The pantheon of Sumerian gods was vast and complex, reflecting the multiplicity of forces in the natural and social worlds. Deities governed every aspect of life, from the fertile rivers to the shifting seasons, from love and war to wisdom and justice. Enlil, the god of air and authority, was often invoked to grant kings legitimacy and enforced order. Enki, the god of water and wisdom, was associated with creation, knowledge, and ingenuity. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, represented both fertility and martial prowess, embodying the dualities of life itself. The stories of these gods were not isolated tales, but interconnected narratives that explained the origins, behaviors, and responsibilities of humanity in relation to the cosmos. Creation myths held a central place in Sumerian belief. According to their accounts, the world began in a primordial chaos, from which the gods formed the heavens, the earth, and all living beings. Humans were created to serve the gods, providing food, labor, and devotion. These myths articulated a worldview in which human life was inseparable from divine will, emphasizing both the privilege and the responsibility of existence. Mortality, labor, and social obligations were framed as intrinsic to human nature, with divine oversight ensuring order and justice. Flood narratives also featured prominently in Sumerian mythology, tales of great deluges in which humanity faced near annihilation, reflected the Sumerians' experiences with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which could bring both nourishment and devastation. The flood myth conveyed moral, practical, and spiritual lessons, illustrating the consequences of disobedience, the mercy of the gods, and the resilience of life. These stories influenced later flood narratives across Mesopotamia and beyond, demonstrating the enduring impact of Sumerian myth on subsequent civilizations. Mythology shaped ethical and social norms. Stories of gods interacting with humans provided models for behavior, illustrating virtues such as loyalty, courage, and piety. Moral dilemmas, divine punishments, and rewards were central themes, teaching individuals about the consequences of their actions. By embedding these lessons in compelling narratives, myths became an effective tool for social cohesion, reinforcing shared values and expectations across the city-state. religious rituals were closely tied to mythological understanding. Festivals, temple offerings, and seasonal ceremonies were often reenactments or commemorations of mythic events. For example, agricultural festivals might honor deities associated with fertility and harvest, ensuring that the cycles of nature continued harmoniously. Temple priests and scribes recorded these myths and their corresponding rituals, preserving both narrative and practice for future generations. Through ritual, myths were brought to life, transforming abstract stories into tangible experiences that structured communal and individual existence. Inat, the goddess of love and war, exemplified the Sumerian approach to myth as a reflection of life's complexities. Her narratives depicted desire, ambition, conflict, and sacrifice, illustrating the duality inherent in human experience. Through her stories, individuals learned about the interplay of power, responsibility, and emotion, understanding that divine behavior could mirror human conduct while transcending it. The Tales of Inanna provided guidance for navigating relationships, politics, and personal aspiration, linking mythology directly to everyday life. Myths also served as historical records, blending fact, legend, and religious interpretation. Epic tales recounted the deeds of heroes, the rise of cities, and the establishment of kingship, intertwining historical events with divine intervention. These narratives legitimized political structures, connecting rulers to gods and asserting that authority was part of a cosmic order. By framing historical events within myth, Sumerians ensured that both memory and ideology were preserved, reinforcing social hierarchies and civic identity. The interplay of myth and cosmology provided a framework for understanding natural phenomena, the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. The patterns of the rivers and the changing seasons were interpreted through mythic narratives. Gods were believed to control or embody these forces, explaining occurrences that might otherwise seem arbitrary or threatening. By attributing natural processes to divine agency, Sumerians established a sense of predictability and meaning in a world often characterized by uncertainty and environmental challenge. Creation and flood myths often highlighted human dependence on the divine. Humans were tasked with labor, worship, and obedience, ensuring that the gods were satisfied and the natural order maintained. These myths emphasized reciprocity. Humans provided offerings, rituals, and service, while gods granted protection, fertility, and prosperity. The understanding that human well-being was directly tied to divine favor reinforced social structures, motivated cooperation, and provided a moral rationale for civic and religious obligations. Mythological narratives also explored themes of life, death, and the afterlife. Stories describe journeys to the underworld, divine judgment, and the continuation of the soul, offering explanations for mortality and ethical conduct. These accounts helped individuals make sense of loss, suffering, and the impermanence of existence, providing comfort and guidance. The intertwining of myth with existential questions demonstrated the depth and sophistication of Sumerian thought, illustrating that mythology was not merely entertainment but a comprehensive worldview. Legends about divine intervention often underscored the importance of justice and law. Kings and rulers were depicted as upholders of divine will, tasked with maintaining order and punishing transgression. Myth reinforced the expectation that human actions had consequences, both temporal and spiritual, and that adherence to ethical and civic duties was essential for communal harmony. In this sense, Mythology served as a tool of social regulation. Integrating spiritual authority with practical governance, Sumerian myths were also preserved and transmitted through literature and visual arts. Clay tablets contained detailed accounts of deities and heroic figures, while reliefs, statues, and murals depicted scenes from mythic stories. This multimodal transmission ensured that myths were accessible, memorable, and influential, shaping both public consciousness and private devotion. Through these mediums, narratives became part of daily life, continuously reinforcing cultural values and beliefs. The role of scribes in recording mythology was critical. By inscribing myths onto clay tablets, they ensured the accuracy and longevity of these narratives. Scribes not only preserved the words of the stories but also encoded cultural, religious, and historical knowledge within them. Their work allowed myths to travel across time and space, influencing neighboring cultures and later civilizations, thereby extending the reach and impact of Sumerian beliefs far beyond their immediate context. Festivals and rituals often reenacted mythic events, allowing participants to engage physically and emotionally with the stories through processions, sacrifices, music, and dance. Myths were transformed from abstract narratives into lived experiences. These communal enactments reinforced shared identity, religious devotion, and social cohesion, creating a tangible connection between narrative and practice. By participating in rituals, individuals internalize the lessons and values embedded in myth, making them active agents in cultural preservation. Myths also reflected the Sumerians' understanding of human nature. Stories depicted ambition, jealousy, love, courage, and folly, illustrating the complexities of behavior and consequence. By projecting these qualities onto divine figures, Sumerians could explore ethical dilemmas, social norms, and personal conduct within a framework that was both engaging and authoritative. Myths thus functioned as moral guides, helping individuals navigate the uncertainties of life through narrative insight. In summary, Sumerian mythology was a foundational element of ancient life, shaping beliefs, guiding behavior, and providing explanations for the natural and social worlds. Myths connected humans to the divine, legitimized political structures, reinforced social norms, and preserved historical memory. Through ritual, literature, and art, these stories permeated daily life, embedding lessons, values, and expectations into the very fabric of society. By studying Sumerian myths, we gain insight into how early civilizations sought to understand their world, justify social organization, and navigate the challenges of existence. Mythology was not merely entertainment. It was an essential system for interpreting reality, teaching morality, and preserving knowledge. The enduring influence of these narratives underscores the sophistication of Sumerian thought and their remarkable ability to integrate spirituality, ethics, and civic life into a coherent worldview that continues to inform historical study today.
The enigmatic Sumerian King Lists. Among the many remarkable artifacts of Sumerian civilization, few are as intriguing or as mysterious as the Sumerian King Lists. These ancient clay tablets, meticulously inscribed in cuneiform, record the names of kings, the lengths of their reigns, and the cities over which they ruled. At first glance, they appear to be straightforward historical documents, yet closer examination reveals a blend of myth, legend, and recorded events that challenges modern understanding of early Mesopotamian history. Scholars have long debated their purpose, authenticity, and the insights they provide into the political, social, and spiritual life of Sumer. The king lists were likely created for multiple purposes. They served to legitimize the authority of reigning kings by linking them to predecessors whose power was often described as divinely sanctioned. By presenting an unbroken line of rulers stretching back to times before the Great Flood, these lists established a sense of continuity and order and a civilization that spanned centuries. The blending of historical rulers with legendary figures, some of whom are said to have reigned for thousands of years, suggests that the lists were not merely administrative records, but also instruments of ideology, reinforcing the notion that kingship was a divinely ordained institution. One of the most striking features of the king lists is the extraordinary lengths attributed to the earliest rulers. Some kings are said to have reigned for tens of thousands of years, a number that defies practical reality. These exaggerated reigns likely reflect symbolic or mythological significance rather than historical fact. They convey a sense of reverence for the earliest figures, who were perceived as intermediaries between gods and humans, bridging the gap between the divine and mortal realms. By exaggerating their longevity, Sumerians emphasized the sacred nature of kingship and the enduring legacy of their civilization. The king lists also revealed the structure of political organization in Sumer. They enumerate the city-states where kingship was established, indicating a pattern of shifting authority among Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagish, and other prominent centers. This movement of kingship highlights the competitive and dynamic nature of early Sumerian politics, where city-states vied for supremacy, and leadership was often concentrated in the hands of those who could assert both military and religious authority. Through these records, modern scholars gain insight into the rise and fall of cities, the distribution of power, and the interconnectivity of early Mesopotamian society. The compilation of the king lists reflects careful organization and a sophisticated understanding of chronology. Scribes categorized rulers according to dynasties and cities, often distinguishing between pre-flood and post-flood reigns. This chronological framework allowed Sumerians to trace authority through generations, establishing historical context for contemporary rulers. While some entries correspond to archaeological evidence and known historical figures, others remain enigmatic, blending myth and reality in a manner that underscores the complexities of Sumerian historiography. Religious and ideological motivations were central to the creation of the king lists. Kingship was perceived not merely as a political role, but as a sacred trust granted by the gods. By documenting the lineage of rulers, the lists reinforced the notion that current kings were part of an unbroken divine mandate. The act of recording and preserving these names was itself a ritualized affirmation of cosmic and civic order. Scribes, acting under temple or royal supervision, played a key role in ensuring that these records were maintained accurately, linking governance, religion, and memory in a single document. The king lists also illuminate the relationship between mythology and history in Sumerian thought. Legendary rulers with impossibly long reigns coexist with historically attested kings, blurring the line between myth and fact. This integration reflects a worldview in which human events were inseparable from divine influence. By embedding mythological figures into historical frameworks, the lists provided moral and cultural lessons, reinforcing the idea that rulers were accountable not only to their subjects, but also to the gods. History was thus inseparable from ideology, teaching lessons about power, responsibility, and divine favor. Archaeological studies of the king lists reveal variations in their content and format. Different copies, discovered in various locations, sometimes include differing names, lengths of reign, or sequences of rulers. These discrepancies suggest that the lists were periodically updated or adapted to suit contemporary political or religious purposes. Kings may have commissioned revisions to emphasize their legitimacy or align themselves with revered ancestors. Such adaptations highlight the fluidity of historical memory in Sumerian culture, where records were simultaneously factual, propagandistic, and symbolic. The lists provide insight into the cultural significance of memory and record-keeping. By preserving the names and reigns of rulers, Sumerians demonstrated a deep concern with continuity and legacy. Kingship was not merely a temporary office, it was part of a broader cosmic and societal order that required documentation for posterity. These records reflect an understanding that history, when written and preserved, could serve as a moral, political, and religious guide for future generations. The meticulous care with which the king lists were compiled underscores the importance of memory in Sumerian civilization. Some entries in the king lists have been correlated with archaeological evidence, providing partial confirmation of historical events and rulers. Excavations of urban centers, royal tombs, and inscriptions sometimes align with the reigns recorded on the lists, offering a glimpse into the early development of city-states, governance, and administrative systems. Yet other entries remain unverified, existing only as names and durations on clay tablets. The mixture of verified and legendary data exemplifies the Sumerian approach to history, one that blends observation, tradition, and ideology in a manner that challenges modern historians but offers rich interpretive possibilities. The king lists also emphasize the transference of kingship among cities, highlighting the fluidity of power in early Sumer. Authority was not permanently fixed in a single city, rather kingship shifted according to divine favor, conquest, or political arrangement. This movement reflects both the competitive environment of early city-states and the Sumerians' belief that divine forces determined the locus of legitimate rule. By tracing the sequence of kings across different urban centers, the lists reveal patterns of political ascendancy, decline, and renewal, illustrating the dynamics of power in a complex society. Beyond political and religious significance, the king lists offer insight into Sumerian conceptions of time and longevity. The exaggerated reigns of early kings may reflect an understanding of time that was cyclical, symbolic, or morally instructive rather than strictly chronological. Such depictions underscore the perceived connection between human rulers and divine forces, suggesting that time itself was measured not only in years, but in moral, spiritual, and cosmic terms. These interpretations provide valuable context for understanding Sumerian philosophy and their approach to history as a tool for teaching and legitimizing authority. The role of scribes in compiling and preserving the king lists cannot be overstated. Their meticulous attention to detail ensured that names, durations, and sequences were recorded consistently, linking myth, legend, and historical observation. Scribes acted as both archivists and interpreters, shaping how subsequent generations would perceive kingship, authority, and passage of time. Their work underscores the broader importance of literacy, record-keeping, and intellectual labor in sustaining complex civilizations. The lists also served as instruments of political propaganda. By presenting a continuous and divinely sanctioned line of rulers, the lists reinforced the legitimacy of contemporary kings, asserting that their authority was rooted in tradition and divine favor. This strategic use of history highlights the interplay between documentation, ideology, and power in Sumerian society. Kingship was not only a practical office, it was a sacred, socially sanctioned institution whose authority was reinforced through the careful curation of historical memory. Historians and archaeologists continue to study the king lists to unravel the interplay of fact and myth. While some aspects remain opaque, the lists offer invaluable insight into how early civilizations documented authority, understood time, and connected human governance with divine mandate. They reflect a sophisticated approach to historiography, one that integrates social, political, and religious perspectives into a coherent narrative of human and divine interaction. Through the study of these ancient records, we gain insight not only into the kings themselves, but also into the values, beliefs, and priorities of Sumerian civilization. The king lists remind us that history in the ancient world was not merely a recounting of events. It was a tool for teaching, legitimizing authority, and preserving cultural identity. These enigmatic tablets continue to challenge, intrigue, and inspire modern scholars, offering a glimpse into the enduring quest of humanity to understand its past, its leaders, and its place in the cosmos.
Stories of floods and the origins of humanity. Among the most enduring narratives in Sumerian mythology are the stories of great floods, events that shaped the understanding of humanity's origins, morality, and relationship with the divine. These flood stories, preserved on clay tablets and passed down through generations, provide insight into the ways the Sumerians interpreted natural disasters and human responsibility. They are not merely tales of water and destruction, but complex narratives that intertwine divine judgment, human survival, and the re-establishment of civilization. Flood myths in Sumer often begin with a world teetering between chaos and order. The gods, observing humanity's behavior, sometimes decided to intervene to correct perceived imbalances. According to these narratives, human beings were created by the gods to serve and sustain them, providing labor, offerings, and devotion. Yet, when humans failed in these duties or exceeded their bounds, divine displeasure could manifest in catastrophic ways. Floods were among the most dramatic expressions of divine judgment, emphasizing the vulnerability of humanity and the supremacy of the gods. One of the earliest flood stories is that of Zusudra, the Sumerian figure often considered a precursor to later flood heroes such as Atrahasis and the biblical Noah. In this tale, the gods resolved to destroy humanity with a massive flood, wiping away cities and communities that had grown disobedient or unruly. Zusudra, however, was chosen to survive due to his piety and obedience. Guided by divine instructions, he constructed a boat, gathered his family, and preserved seeds and livestock, ensuring the continuation of life after the deluge. The story of Zusudra reveals several themes central to Sumerian thought. First, it emphasizes the moral responsibility of humanity. Survival is granted not arbitrarily, but in recognition of virtue and adherence to divine expectation. Second, it highlights the relationship between humans and the natural world. Floods are depicted not merely as random events, but as instruments of cosmic and moral order. By portraying natural disasters as divinely directed, Sumerian narratives integrated human experience with theology, creating a worldview in which ethical behavior and survival were intimately connected. Flood stories also functioned as explanations for historical events. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, while essential to agriculture and daily life, were unpredictable and capable of devastating inundations. Ancient communities experienced actual floods that could obliterate settlements and reshape the landscape. Mythology provided a means of contextualizing these experiences, transforming natural catastrophe into narrative with lessons and meaning. In this sense, Sumerian flood myths represent an early attempt to reconcile environmental realities with cultural understanding. These narratives reinforced the importance of obedience, ritual, and devotion. By presenting the flood as a response to human behavior, myths underscored the necessity of maintaining proper relationships with the gods. Temple rituals, offerings, and festivals were ways for communities to demonstrate loyalty and prevent divine wrath. The preservation of humanity by Zusudra exemplified the rewards of piety and adherence to established norms, serving as both a warning and a guide for subsequent generations. The construction of the ark or boat in these stories demonstrates the practical and symbolic dimensions of human ingenuity. Following divine instructions, Zusudra built a vessel capable of withstanding the floodwaters, gathering his family, livestock, and provisions. This act illustrates the combination of obedience, resourcefulness, and foresight that was highly valued in Sumerian society. The narrative frames survival as the product of both divine favor and human action, reinforcing the interplay between mortality, ethics, and skill. Flood myths also address the origins of humanity and the continuity of life. By saving a select few, the gods ensured that civilization could be re-established after devastation. These stories function as etiological tales, explaining how human societies, knowledge, and culture persisted despite natural and divine forces that could have erased them. The emphasis on preservation of people, animals, and crops reflects the Sumerian understanding of civilization as fragile yet resilient, dependent on human cooperation and divine grace alike. In addition to moral and historical significance, flood narratives carried cosmological meaning. Water was both life-giving and destructive, symbolizing the dual nature of the cosmos. The flood served as a cleansing mechanism, removing corruption and restoring order, a concept that resonated across other aspects of Sumerian thought. This symbolic interpretation reinforced the idea that disasters were not arbitrary, but purposeful, structured within a moral and cosmological framework that made sense of human experience. Flood stories also intersected with kingship and authority. By preserving select individuals, the gods reinforced the notion that leadership, survival, and societal organization were divinely sanctioned. Zusudra's survival can be interpreted as a divine endorsement of moral and competent leadership, emphasizing that rulers and community members alike were accountable to higher powers. These narratives helped legitimize governance structures, linking political authority to divine oversight. Sumerian flood myths influenced subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations. The Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians preserved versions of these stories, adapting names, details, and emphases while retaining the core moral and cosmological lessons. The persistence of flood narratives highlights the enduring cultural importance of these tales, demonstrating that they addressed universal human concerns: morality, survival, divine justice, and the origins of civilization. These myths also provided a framework for understanding human vulnerability and resilience. While the flood represented destruction and divine displeasure, the survival of the righteous affirmed the possibility of renewal and continuity. This duality offered communities both caution and hope, teaching that human actions mattered while also providing a vision of recovery and regeneration. Through storytelling, the Sumerians conveyed lessons about ethics, labor, leadership, and divine human relations in a form accessible and memorable to all members of society. Through the flood narratives, Sumerians explored themes of obedience, ingenuity, and morality. Human survival required careful adherence to divine instruction, practical skill, and moral integrity. By embedding these themes in compelling stories, the myths served as both educational tools and cultural touchstones. They reinforced societal norms, provided ethical guidance, and offered explanations for otherwise inexplicable events, integrating human experience into a coherent worldview. Flood myths were preserved and transmitted through scribal records, temple teachings, and oral tradition. Clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform ensured the longevity of these stories, allowing them to influence generations long after their initial composition. The role of scribes in maintaining, copying, and interpreting these narratives was crucial, as they bridged the temporal gap between past events, mythic memory, and contemporary understanding. Through their labor, the lessons and stories of the flood endured, shaping the intellectual and cultural landscape of Mesopotamia. In summary, the Sumerian stories of floods and humanity's origins are more than tales of water and catastrophe. They are complex narratives that integrate morality, divine authority, and the fragility of civilization. By combining historical experience, environmental observation, and theological reflection, these myths provided communities with frameworks for understanding their world, guiding behavior, and preserving knowledge. They exemplify the Sumerian approach to storytelling as a tool for education, cultural continuity, and social cohesion. By examining these narratives, modern readers gain insight into how the earliest civilizations interpreted natural disasters, human responsibility, and the beginnings of societal life. Flood myths remind us that Sumerians were not merely passive observers of the environment. They actively sought to comprehend, explain, and transmit lessons about the world around them. Through these stories, the interplay of divine judgment, human action, and societal continuity becomes apparent, highlighting the sophistication of Sumerian thought and the enduring power of myth in shaping human understanding.
Technological innovations that surprised the world. The Sumerians were not only builders of cities, creators of written language, and chroniclers of myths. They were also remarkable inventors whose technological innovations laid the foundations for many aspects of civilization that would endure for millennia. From practical tools to complex systems of measurement, Sumerian ingenuity transformed daily life, governance, agriculture, and commerce in ways that continue to surprise modern historians. Understanding these technological achievements sheds light on how one of the world's earliest civilizations achieved such sophistication. One of the most notable Sumerian innovations was the development of irrigation systems. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers provided both life-giving water and the potential for devastating floods, and managing these waters required significant engineering expertise. Farmers constructed canals, dikes, and reservoirs to channel water to fields, enabling year-round agriculture in a region where rainfall was insufficient. These systems required careful planning, maintenance, and community coordination, and they allowed Sumerians to cultivate surplus crops, which in turn supported population growth, urbanization, and trade. The wheel, one of humanity's most transformative inventions, is widely credited to Sumerian engineers. Initially used in pottery, the wheel revolutionized transportation when applied to carts and wagons. This innovation facilitated the movement of goods, people, and resources across the region, linking cities and trade networks more efficiently than ever before. Wheeled vehicles reduced the labor required for transport, expanded the reach of commerce, and provided a practical tool for both agriculture and warfare. The invention of the wheel illustrates how technological advancements could ripple through multiple aspects of society, influencing economic, social, and military life simultaneously. Sumerians also developed advanced methods of metallurgy. Working with copper, bronze, and other metals, they created tools, weapons, and ornaments that were stronger and more durable than their stone predecessors. The discovery of bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, allowed for the production of sharper, longer-lasting tools and implements. Metalworking required precise knowledge of materials, temperature control, and casting techniques, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of chemistry and engineering principles. These advances not only improved daily labor, but also enabled military and construction projects that would have been impossible with simpler tools. Measurement and mathematics were other areas where Sumerians excelled. They developed systems for counting, weighing, and measuring both goods and land, using a sexagesimal, base 60 system that underlies our modern concepts of time, angles, and geometry. Clay tokens and early counting devices allowed merchants, farmers, and administrators to keep track of trade, resources, and production with remarkable accuracy. This numerical system provided a framework for economic management, urban planning, and scientific inquiry, demonstrating that Sumerian technology was as much intellectual as it was physical. Architectural innovations also marked Sumerian cities. Mud brick construction allowed for the creation of durable homes, walls, and public buildings. Temples and ziggurats, with their massive stepped platforms, exemplified advanced knowledge of engineering, spatial planning, and religious symbolism. Builders developed techniques to create stable foundations, arches, and drainage systems, ensuring that structures could withstand seasonal floods and the test of time. These architectural accomplishments reflect a blend of practical knowledge, aesthetic consideration, and spiritual purpose. The Sumerians' approach to record-keeping and writing was itself a technological achievement. The development of cuneiform required specialized tools, including reed styluses and clay tablets, as well as precise methods of impression and arrangement. This writing system enabled the documentation of commerce, legal codes, religious texts, and scientific observations. By standardizing communication and preserving knowledge in a durable medium, Sumerians ensured that information could survive across generations, creating a foundation for both bureaucracy and cultural continuity. Water management also led to innovations in infrastructure. Sumerians constructed canals not only for irrigation but also for transportation, enabling the movement of goods by boat. Lock systems, dams, and sluices were developed to regulate water flow, demonstrating both practical engineering skill and an understanding of hydrodynamics. These innovations allowed cities to expand, trade to flourish, and agriculture to thrive, creating an integrated system in which technology directly supported societal growth. In medicine, Sumerians applied observation, diagnosis, and documentation to treat common ailments. Clay tablets record lists of symptoms, remedies, and procedures, combining herbal knowledge with ritual practices. These early medical texts reveal that Sumerians sought to understand the human body, the causes of disease, and methods of treatment. The ability to codify medical knowledge and transmit it to others reflects a sophisticated technological and intellectual culture, one in which empirical observation and spiritual practice were intertwined. Astronomy and timekeeping also benefited from Sumerian innovation. Observing the stars and planets, Sumerians developed lunar calendars to guide agricultural cycles, religious festivals, and civic events. The base 60 numerical system facilitated precise calculations of angles, time, and celestial cycles, allowing for predictions of eclipses and other phenomena. By linking celestial observation to practical life, Sumerians created a technology of understanding the cosmos that would influence later civilizations in Mesopotamia and beyond. Sumerian innovations in textiles and manufacturing also had wide-reaching effects. They developed techniques for spinning, weaving, and dyeing fibers, producing fabrics that were both durable and decorative. Workshops organized labor efficiently, with specialized roles for carding, spinning, weaving, and finishing. These technological improvements increased productivity, supported trade, and provided goods that reinforced social status and ceremonial importance. The sophistication of textile technology reflects the integration of craft, economy, and culture in everyday life. Another remarkable invention was the plow, which transformed agriculture by making soil preparation faster and more efficient. Sumerian plows, often pulled by oxen, allowed farmers to cultivate larger areas of land with less manual labor. This innovation directly contributed to food surplus, population growth, and urban expansion. The plow exemplifies how technological tools could have profound effects on societal development, linking technology to economic stability and social organization. Sumerians also innovated in transportation and logistics. They developed barges and boats capable of carrying heavy cargo along rivers, enhancing trade and resource distribution. Roads and city streets were designed to accommodate carts, foot traffic, and animals, reflecting careful planning and civil engineering knowledge. These systems facilitated commerce, communication, and administration, making urban life more efficient and interconnected. Transportation technology, therefore, was not isolated, but integrated into broader economic and social networks. The Sumerians' understanding of time and measurement extended to geometry and surveying. They created standardized units for length, area, and volume, enabling accurate construction, land division, and taxation. These innovations provided practical solutions to administrative and logistical challenges, demonstrating that technology in Sumer was a combination of theory, calculation, and hands-on application. In summary, Sumerian technological innovations were far-reaching and multifaceted. From irrigation and plowing to writing, astronomy, and metallurgy, these advancements transformed daily life, governance, and culture. They enabled the development of cities, the growth of trade, the organization of labor, and the transmission of knowledge across generations. Sumerian technology was not merely practical, it was intertwined with societal values, religious practice, and intellectual achievement. By studying these innovations,
astronomy and mathematics in early Sumer. In the quiet courtyards of ancient Sumerian temples, where oil lamps flickered against mud brick walls and the desert winds whispered across open roofs, some of the earliest astronomers and mathematicians began shaping ideas that would echo across human history. Their work was not driven by curiosity alone. It was woven deeply into agriculture, ritual, architecture, governance, and even the rhythms of daily life. The skies above Mesopotamia were not merely a backdrop for storytelling. They were a functional calendar, a map, and a divine text waiting to be interpreted. Long before telescopes existed, Sumerian observers carefully documented the positions of stars, planets, and lunar phases with astonishing accuracy. They recognized patterns in the heavens, tracking celestial cycles across seasons and years. This attention was practical. Crops needed predictable schedules, festivals required precise timing, and temples had to align with celestial markers. What began as observation gradually became a structured science, supported by mathematics that was uniquely suited for calculation. Perhaps the most influential mathematical contribution of early Sumer was the adoption of the sexagenesimal or base 60 number system. Today, it seems natural that an hour contains 60 minutes and a circle contains 360 degrees, but these conventions originate from the slow, careful work of Sumerian scholars. Base 60 was remarkably flexible. It allowed for easy division and supported complex calculations without advanced tools. Clay tablets found in ancient archives reveal work that would challenge even modern students. Multiplication tables, square roots, geometric calculations, and detailed lists of astronomical observations. These mathematical tools helped Sumerians track the lunar month with exceptional precision. The moon cycle was central to their calendar, guiding planting seasons and religious ceremonies. By observing variations in the moon's appearance and behavior, Sumerian scholars refined their month into a system that aligned well with agricultural needs. Over time, they built a calendar that was stable, functional, and adaptable, setting the foundation for later Babylonian and even modern timekeeping systems. Astronomy in Sumer was deeply intertwined with religion. High-ranking priests, known as Watchers of the Night, climbed temple platforms to observe the sky. Ziggurats, those iconic step towers, served not only as places of worship, but also as elevated observatories, where the horizon could be seen clearly in every direction. From these vantage points, priests tracked rising and setting stars, noted seasonal constellations, and identified omens believed to reflect divine intention. Their records were not just scientific logs, but guided political decisions, ritual timings, and state planning. The Sumerians also noticed that planets moved differently from stars, wandering slowly across constellations in patterns that could be charted. Although they didn't understand the mechanics of planetary orbits, they recognized predictability in these movements. Planetary behavior influenced divination practices, reinforcing the idea that celestial bodies communicated messages from the gods. Daily life, from the best time to travel to decisions about war, could be shaped by the night sky. Mathematics extended far beyond astronomy. Fields and canals needed exact measurement, especially in a landscape where water meant the difference between abundance and disaster. Surveyors, using ropes and wooden rods, applied geometric principles to divide land, calculate crop yields, and determine labor quotas. Clay tablets show that Sumerians understood the concept of area, volume, and proportional relationships, using their base 60 system to solve practical problems clearly and consistently. This administrative mathematics allowed cities to grow more complex, supporting bureaucracy, long-distance trade, and organized labor in ways that required dependable numerical systems. Even education reflected the importance of math and astronomy. In tablet schools, young scribes spent countless hours practicing numbers and solving calculations under the supervision of masters. The exercises were not abstract. They were essential for roles in administration, commerce, and temple service. The endurance of these tablet schools, which many survive in excellent condition, provides invaluable insight into how knowledge was taught, structured, and preserved. Astronomy contributed directly to architectural design. Temples and ceremonial buildings were often aligned with solstices, equinoxes, or important stellar risings. This alignment was not merely symbolic. It demonstrated a sophisticated blend of engineering and celestial understanding. Seasonal markers could indicate the time for harvest festivals, New Year celebrations, or agricultural preparations. By embedding astronomy into architecture, the Sumerians created structures that physically expressed the connection between the heavens and human society. The Sumerians also recognized the importance of long-term cycles. They understood that celestial events repeated, inspiring efforts to predict future occurrences. Over many years, careful record-keeping allowed scholars to anticipate eclipses, track planetary positions, and refine calendars. These long-term observations reflected a worldview in which time was not merely linear, but cyclical, an endless pattern mirrored in both nature and the heavens. The relationship between astronomy and mythology in Sumer was subtle and complex. While myths explained the actions of gods through symbolic narratives, astronomy provided a structured, empirical foundation for understanding the world. The interplay between the two allowed Sumerians to balance spiritual interpretation with practical knowledge, creating a worldview where the heavens were simultaneously divine and measurable. In agriculture, astronomy knowledge determined when to plow, plant, irrigate, and harvest. Rising of certain stars signaled seasonal changes, guiding farmers in their work. In this sense, astronomy functioned as both a scientific tool and a cultural guide, shaping routines that affected every household. Without this celestial awareness, the stability of Sumer's food supply would have been far more precarious. Mathematics also supported long-distance trade. Merchants used standardized numerical systems to calculate prices, convert units, and maintain inventory. This consistency enabled the growth of trade networks that extended beyond Mesopotamia into Anatolia, the Levant, and even distant regions. Without a reliable mathematical framework, such networks would have been impractical. In many ways, the Sumerian approach to math and astronomy represented an early scientific mindset. They observed, recorded, analyzed, and applied their findings to real-world problems. Their work did not rely on advanced instruments, but on disciplined repetition, systematic record-keeping, and the willingness to let patterns reveal their meaning over time.
This methodology laid the groundwork for future civilizations, influencing Babylonian astronomers, Greek mathematicians, and countless later scholars. Ultimately, Sumerian astronomy and mathematics formed a quiet but powerful backbone of their civilization, from calendars that organized city life to measurements that defined architecture, from trade systems to celestial omens. These disciplines shaped the rhythms of everyday existence. Their numerical legacy still guides our clocks and compasses, reminding us that some of humanity's most enduring tools were shaped under Mesopotamian skies thousands of years ago.
Trade networks connecting distant lands. Long before caravans crossed vast deserts and ships sailed confidently along mapped coastlines, the Sumerians had already begun forming the earliest known trade networks in human history. Their cities, Uruk, Lagash, Eridu, stood not as isolated settlements, but as hubs connected to distant lands by a web of exchange that carried goods, resources, and ideas across great distances. These networks transformed Sumer into a thriving economic powerhouse and shaped the cultural character of ancient Mesopotamia. At the heart of Sumerian trade was necessity. The lands of southern Mesopotamia, though fertile with irrigation, lacked key natural resources. There were no forests for lumber, no quarries for large stone, and only limited mineral deposits. Yet the growing cities demanded materials for building, crafting, ornamentation, and ritual. To supply these needs, the Sumerians turned outward, forging relationships that stretched far beyond their borders. Trade with neighboring regions began simply. Early exchanges included grain, fish, and woven goods traded for raw materials from the nearby Zagros Mountains or the Arabian coastline. Over time, these modest interactions grew into structured economic partnerships. The Sumerians developed specialized merchant classes and established trade routes both overland and by river, eventually extending their reach to regions that lay hundreds of miles away. The Euphrates River served as a natural highway, carrying boats loaded with goods northward into Akkad and beyond. Flat-bottomed vessels, constructed to navigate the shallow waters, transported grain, textiles, reeds, and crafted items. These boats also returned with timber, fruits, and metals from northern settlements. The river allowed for the efficient movement of heavy cargo, reducing travel time and strengthening ties between cities. Overland routes extended eastward toward the Iranian plateau. Here, Sumerian merchants traded with communities that supplied copper, tin, stone, and precious semi-precious gems. These materials were essential for metalworking and ornamentation, making Eastern trade a backbone of Sumerian craft production. Caravans of donkeys, loaded with goods and guided by experienced traders, crossed mountain passes and plains, forming lifelines that connected distant cultures to the cities of the southern plain. To the west, trade reached into the Levant, where Sumerians acquired timber, especially cedar, which was highly valued for construction and shipbuilding. Logs too large for overland transport were floated on rafts across rivers and transported along coastal waters. This Western trade also introduced new artistic styles, religious motifs, and cultural ideas that would subtly influence Sumerian expression over time. Perhaps the most remarkable trade connection extended southward to the region known in ancient records as Magan and Dilmun, believed to correspond to parts of modern-day Oman and Bahrain. These coastal lands supplied copper and served as key maritime intermediaries, linking Sumer with even more distant regions like the Indus Valley. Ships built from reed bundles and wooden planks sailed across the Persian Gulf, carrying trade goods between harbors that bustled with activity. One of the most intriguing aspects of Sumerian trade is the evidence of commercial links with the Indus Valley civilization, a society hundreds of miles away across land and sea. Archaeological discoveries reveal Indus seals in Sumerian cities and Mesopotamian motifs in Harappan sites.
suggesting a robust exchange of goods and ideas. The Sumerians imported carnelian beads, timber, ivory, and exotic woods from the Indus region, while exporting woolen textiles, silver, and crafted items in return. Although separated by vast distances, the two civilizations maintained a steady flow of commerce, demonstrating the sophistication of early international trade. Within Sumerian cities, trade created entire industries. Workshops produced textiles, pottery, metal goods, and tools, often in great quantities, to supply both domestic and foreign markets. Skilled artisans crafted intricate jewelry from imported stones, bronze tools from imported metals, and beautifully decorated pottery that traveled far beyond their city of origin. Trade became not only a means of survival, but a driver of economic specialization and innovation. Sumerian merchants played a central role in maintaining these networks. These individuals, known as Tomkaram, were not simple traders, but experienced negotiators, logisticians, and financial managers. They kept detailed records of transactions on clay tablets, documenting every shipment, agreement, and payment. Their responsibilities extended across borders, and they often acted as ambassadors of their cities, building trust and continuity with foreign partners. The state also played an important role. Temples and royal institutions organized large-scale trade expeditions, especially those involving high-value materials, like metals, timber, and luxury goods. These institutions managed resources, paid workers, and coordinated long-distance transportation. Through this involvement, trade became a structured economic system rather than a series of isolated exchanges. Trade reshaped Sumerian society in subtle yet enduring ways. Contact with foreign cultures introduced new art forms, technologies, and ideas. Decorative patterns on pottery, musical instruments, and jewelry often reflected influences from distant lands. Even religious concepts sometimes incorporated foreign elements, demonstrating how cultural exchange accompanied economic activity. The goods transported through Sumerian networks tell a vivid story of the era's interconnectedness. From the west came cedar, olive oil, wine, and stone. From the east arrived metals, precious stones, and unique mountain goods. From the south came copper, pearls, incense, and marine products from Gulf regions. And from distant Indus lands came beads, ivory, hardwoods, and cultural symbols that subtly blended with Mesopotamian traditions. Sumerian trade required infrastructure to support its complexity. Cities built warehouses, docks, and administrative centers to manage goods. Weights and measures were standardized, ensuring fairness in exchange. Written contracts formalized agreements between merchants, establishing reliability in transactions. This growing economic sophistication strengthened urban development, allowing cities to thrive with organized markets and bustling trade districts. The benefits of these networks extended into daily life. Ordinary families gained access to luxury items, ornaments, fine textiles, and rare foods that enriched their cultural experiences. Farmers could trade surplus grain for tools or raw materials unavailable in their own region. Artisans found wider markets for their crafts, while rulers could display wealth accumulated through international commerce, reinforcing their authority and prestige. Through trade, the Sumerians developed a worldview that extended beyond the horizon of their river-fed plains. They understood that distant lands held resources essential for their survival and prosperity. They recognized that cooperation, negotiation, and mutual benefit formed the foundation of stable trade relations. This awareness encouraged a broader sense of connection, one that transcended local boundaries and introduced the earliest forms of cultural interdependence.
In many ways, Sumerian trade networks laid the groundwork for later global systems. They demonstrated that long-distance exchange was not only possible, but economically transformative. They showed that cultural contact enriched societies,
fostering innovation and shared knowledge. And they reflected the ingenuity of early merchants, sailors, and artisans who navigated uncertain distances to bring the world a little closer together. Social hierarchies and roles of women. In the layered world of ancient Sumer, society was arranged much like the stepped terraces of a ziggurat, structured, rising in levels, and each platform carrying its own weight of duty, privilege, and expectation. To the modern eye, this hierarchy might look rigid, even unforgiving, but to those who lived within it, the pattern felt as old and unchanging as the clay beneath their feet. And among these layers, the lives of women, often overlooked by scribes concerned mostly with kings and conquests, formed a quieter but deeply essential force that shaped the very rhythm of Sumerian civilization. A society built on order. At the top of the social pyramid stood the king, the Lugal, believed to be chosen by the gods themselves. Beneath him were priests, generals, wealthy merchants, and high-ranking officials who oversaw the city's major decisions. The middle layers consisted of craftsmen, traders, builders, and farmers, people whose hands brought the city to life each day. At the bottom were laborers, servants, and enslaved individuals whose work remained largely invisible, but whose presence enabled the upper tiers to thrive. But this structure was never only about occupation or wealth. It governed relationships, privileges, and unspoken rules of behavior. One's birth determined one's standing, but so too did one's skills, piety, and allegiance. In this swirling, layered system, identity was not merely personal, it was deeply communal. Women at the heart of the home and beyond. Though ancient Sumer was undeniably patriarchal, women were far from silent or powerless. Their influence reached into domestic, economic, religious, and even political arenas, sometimes subtly, sometimes boldly, depending on the family's status and the city's customs. In the household, for most women, daily life revolved around the home. Grinding grain, brewing beer, a respected skill, weaving textiles, preparing food, managing servants if the family could afford them, and raising children in the stories, customs, and obligations of their ancestors. To the outsider, this might sound limiting, but Sumerian households depended heavily on women's expertise. Efficient brewing and weaving were not minor chores, they were essential economic engines. A skilled brewer could elevate a family standing. A talented weaver could help her household secure trade connections. And a mother's role in child-rearing was considered sacred, tied to the well-being of the lineage itself. In the marketplace, unlike in many later civilizations, Sumerian women often engaged directly in commerce. Records from city archives, etched into clay tablets that still survive today, mention women who managed businesses, owned property, purchased and sold goods, and even made loans. Some were renowned for their craftsmanship, especially in textile production. Others ran taverns, lively hubs where travelers traded stories, deals were struck, and local gossip flowed freely like the beer in clay cups. To walk through a Sumerian market was to hear women bargaining, instructing apprentices, balancing ledgers, or scolding dishonest traders. Their presence was unmistakable, woven into the very pulse of daily economic life. Nobility and priestesses. In wealthier families and noble lineages, women sometimes held remarkable influence. The high priestess, Enhedwana, daughter of King Sargon of Akkad, who served as the high priestess of the moon god Nana in Ur, was not only a religious authority, but also one of the earliest known authors in human history. Her hymns carried political weight, spiritual depth, and personal emotion, unusual for the time. Her role exemplifies the extraordinary positions women could reach within Sumer's religious system. High priestesses supervised temple estates, managed large staffs, directed economic activity and shaped the spiritual direction of their city-states. Their authority sometimes rivaled that of male priests. Elite women and lineage. Noble women often served as the anchors of powerful families. They arranged marriages, strengthened political alliances, and acted as guardians of heritage. In times of crisis, such as disputes over succession, women of the elite sometimes mediated negotiations or helped to decide who would be recognized as heir. Their influence often operated behind the scenes, but its impact could ripple through an entire dynasty. Marriage, motherhood, and legal rights. Sumerian marriage was a well-structured institution, formalized through contracts that protected property, inheritance, and obligations. Women could own property, buy and sell land, inherit wealth, and initiate certain legal proceedings. Marriage did not erase their rights. If anything, it sometimes expanded them. Divorce and protection. Although divorce was easily initiated by men, women had protections. A husband who abandoned or mistreated his wife could face fines, loss of property, or public shame. If a husband fell ill or was captured in war, his wife could manage his estate. These legal nuances show a society trying, imperfectly but earnestly, to balance patriarchal norms with practical fairness. Women in stories and myths. Mythology offered another lens into women's roles. Goddesses played enormous symbolic and cultural roles. Inanna, goddess of love, war, and transformation, ferocious, unpredictable, and politically powerful. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, associated with fertility, creation, and the stability of the earth. Nanshi, the patroness of social justice, protector of widows, orphans, and the poor. These deities shaped how society viewed women, not as background figures, but as forces capable of creation, destruction, wisdom, and authority. Myths whispered a truth beneath the surface of daily life. Women carried not only domestic roles, but cosmic ones. Laborers and enslaved women. At the lower rungs of the social hierarchy, life was harsher. Women in these groups often worked in large-scale farms, temple estates, weaving factories, grinding houses, or as domestic servants. Their stories rarely survived in clay records. Their names were almost never preserved. Yet they formed the backbone of the city's labor force. Without their relentless work, tedious, exhausting, and often unacknowledged, the temples, palaces, and markets of Sumer would have collapsed. A society held together by many hands. Across every layer of society, women shaped Sumer not only through birth and marriage, but through labor, creativity, spirituality, and resilience. Their experiences were far from uniform, ranging from empowered priestesses to overworked laborers, but their collective contribution was undeniable. In the quiet courtyards of city homes, in the bustling chaos of market streets, in the dim glow of temple chambers, and in the stone-built halls of noble estates, women's voices echoed, sometimes softly, sometimes fiercely, always indispensably. And though ancient scribes tended to focus their stylus strokes on kings, conquests, and divine decrees, the true heartbeat of Sumer lay equally in the hands of the women who sustained it. Their stories, though often hidden, continued to shape the narrative that the next chapters of this long journey would slowly uncover.
Artistic expressions, sculpture, jewelry, and seals. Art in ancient Sumer did not simply decorate life, it explained it, preserved it, and justified it. Every stroke carved into stone, every bead strung onto a necklace, every image pressed into a clay tablet carried meaning deeper than the material itself. To walk through the artistic world of Sumer was to walk through the mind of a civilization discovering how to describe itself. The silent faces in stone. The sculptors of Sumer worked in a language without sound. Their voices were their hands,
and their words were the grooves they etched into limestone, alabaster, and diorite. In workshops that smelled of dust and wet clay, they spent long hours shaping figures that would watch over temples, graves, and palaces. One of the most distinctive Sumerian creations was the votive statue, wide-eyed figures kneeling or standing with hands clasped in prayer. Those enormous, watchful eyes were not just stylistic exaggeration, they were meant to symbolize eternal devotion, as if the statue itself continued to pray long after its human counterpart had returned home from the temple. To the people who crafted them, these statues were more than art. They were bridges, objects that connected the physical and spiritual realms. A sculptor named Iti might smooth the clay brow of a figurine with his thumb and whisper a small blessing before delivering it to a patron. That small gesture, repeated across centuries, shaped the emotional weight of Sumerian art. Every figure held a piece of the maker's faith, alongside the patron's hope. Larger statues of kings, priests, and legendary heroes carried a different message. Their rigid poses, strong shoulders, and carefully carved garments broadcast power and permanence. They reminded viewers that authority was not fleeting, but grounded in divine order. Yet even in their stoic expressions, one could sometimes find a human softness, a slight curve at the corner of a lip, or a gently bowed head. These small touches suggested that the artists, even while working within strict conventions, saw their subjects as living beings, not abstract symbols. Jewelry, beauty, status, and protection. If sculpture revealed the Sumerian spiritual heart, their jewelry revealed their dreams of beauty, power, and identity. The jewelry of ancient Sumer was astonishingly sophisticated, even by modern standards. Goldsmiths crafted delicate earrings, necklaces, bracelets, and diadems using techniques such as filigree, granulation, and intricate inlay work, methods that would remain advanced for thousands of years. Jewelry served many purposes. Adornment. Women draped themselves in gold and lapis lazuli on special occasions, shimmering like the dawn breaking over the Euphrates. Even everyday wear included small beads or bracelets, little reminders of beauty amidst labor. Status. A noblewoman's headdress or a merchant's gilded seal instantly revealed their place in society. Wealth was displayed openly, but so was the craftsmanship of the artisans who created these treasures. Divine protection. Many pieces of jewelry carried protective symbols. Small amulets shaped like lions, fish, or crescent moons were believed to repel misfortune. Mothers often tied beads around their children's wrists or necks, whispering prayers as they fastened the knots. Burial rituals. In royal tombs, archaeologists would one day find breathtaking pieces: spun gold wreaths, serpent-shaped bracelets, necklaces made from imported turquoise and carnelian, and elaborate hair ornaments crafted with almost impossibly tiny details. These pieces were not only offerings for the afterlife, but reflections of the lives their wearers had led, lives filled with ceremony, beauty, and a deep belief that art could accompany the soul beyond death. Cylinder seals, stories rolled into clay. Perhaps the most iconic artistic innovation of Sumer, and arguably one of the most brilliant inventions of the ancient world, was the cylinder seal. Imagine a tiny carved roller, small enough to fit in your hand. Now imagine it holding an entire story. Gods in conversation, animals walking in procession, kings receiving gifts, prayers, contracts, symbols, myths, all carved onto its surface in reverse. When the seal was rolled across wet clay, the story appeared in perfect detail. The first signatures. Cylinder seals functioned like a personal signature, a badge of identity. Officials wore them on cords around their wrists or necks, ready to authenticate a tablet or lock a storage jar. Each seal was unique, crafted to match the status and personality of its owner. A merchant seal might depict boats and fish, symbolizing trade and abundance. A priest's seal might show a god seated on a throne, granting authority.
A noblewoman's seal might depict a scene of ritual or divine protection. A soldier's seal might feature a warrior defeating a lion or monster. In a world without paper or ink, these seals were essential tools of bureaucracy and tiny masterpieces of artistic expression. The craftsman behind the magic. The artist who carved cylinder seals, often working with materials like lapis lazuli, serpentine, or shell, had remarkable skill. They used copper drills, tiny chisels, and a brace of sand to cut microscopic details into the stone. Their work demanded patience and precision. The slightest mistake could ruin hours of labor. Imagine the concentration of a seal maker, leaning over his workbench in the morning light, turning the stone slowly, carving an archer's bow or a god's star crown smaller than a grain of wheat. Each finished seal was both a tool and a treasure, a miniature world captured in stone. Art as identity and memory. Across the cities of Sumer, Uruk, Lagash, Ur, Eridu, art did more than decorate. It communicated. It said, "This is who we are. This is what we believe. This is what we fear, honor, protect, and hope for." Sumerian art was never purely ornamental. It carried meaning in every line and curve. The tilt of a statue's head, the spiral of a braided beard, the gleam of gold in a necklace, the swirling symmetry of a seal's imprint. Art preserved memory. It outlived the sculptor. It outlasted the patron. It survived the collapse of dynasties, the drawing of rivers, the shifting of sands. And when future archaeologists uncovered these pieces, thousands of years later, they found messages still intact, waiting patiently to speak again. A culture that understood permanence. What makes Sumerian artistic expression so captivating is how thoroughly it reflects the values of the civilization itself. The people of Sumer understood that life was fragile. Floods, famine, war, and disease always loomed. But through art, durable, intentional, sacred, they carved out a kind of permanence. A statue placed in a temple might stand for centuries. A piece of jewelry could be passed from mother to daughter. A cylinder seal could travel across generations, its story unchanged. A carved stone could defy time in a way a human body never could. Their art was a promise that beauty mattered, that identity mattered, that memory was worth preserving. A world still revealing itself. And so, in the soft glow of lamplight in a Sumerian workshop, or in the silence of a burial chamber filled with gold ornaments, or in the crisp impression of a seal rolled across clay, we catch glimpses of a civilization that knew how to express its soul, not loudly, not extravagantly, but with detail, devotion, and a deep understanding of what it meant to be human. And as the story moves forward, the next layers of Sumer's identity will continue to unfold, revealing how technology, war, mythology, and society shaped the world's first great civilization.
Secrets hidden in clay tablets. For modern eyes, the clay tablets of ancient Sumer seem plain. Small rectangles of baked earth, dull in color and modest in appearance. Yet within these fragile slabs rests one of humanity's greatest treasures, a record of thought, memory, ritual, conflict, calculation, and curiosity written more than 4,000 years ago. These tablets were never meant to impress through beauty. Their power came from the permanence of written words, pressed carefully into wet clay by scribes who understood the immense weight of what they were doing. To lift a Sumerian tablet is to feel the echo of a world that refused to disappear. The quiet work of the scribes. Inside a tablet room, often attached to a temple or palace, scribes bent over clay slabs while the faint smell of wet earth filled the air. They used stylus tips carved from reeds,
working with steady hands to press wedge-shaped marks into the soft surface. There was no ink, no brush, no parchment, only clay and concentration. Their work covered everything from taxes to myths. They wrote about grain harvests, temple rituals, court proceedings, and shipments of fish moving down the Euphrates River. They recorded marriages, debts, prayers, and astronomical observations. These men, and occasionally women, were the custodians of civilization, transforming human experience into fixed memory. But as time passed, some scribes began writing things that extended beyond the demands of administration. They wrote stories that asked questions. They wrote poems that wrestled with destiny. They wrote myths that examined the human relationship with gods. It is in those writings, preserved almost accidentally by fire or burial, that the real secrets of Sumer began to emerge. Everyday life captured in clay. The majority of tablets were practical. A farmer named Lugalam might bring a record of his barley yield to the temple. A merchant would register his imported copper shipments. A priestess might check inventories of temple livestock. These everyday details, while mundane, allow modern historians to reconstruct the rhythm of life, how many goats a family owned, what taxes they paid, what crops succeeded or failed, who owed whom money, which professions earned status, and even what disputes erupted among neighbors. Most tablets were not intended as historical records. They were simply required documents of daily functioning. Yet in their ordinariness lies their brilliance. They create a picture of ancient Sumer far richer and truer than any legend. But scattered among the accounts and lists are tablets that offer a different kind of truth, one woven from imagination, fear, and wonder. Myths and epics that survived the centuries. Among the most extraordinary clay tablets are those that contain stories older than nearly all of the world's written literature. These tablets were not filed away like administrative documents. They were copied, recopied, and refined, passed from scribe to apprentice. Here, hidden between lines of cuneiform, we find great tales, the early forms of the Epic of Gilgamesh, describing a king who feared death and sought meaning. Myths of Inanna, the goddess who descended into the underworld and returned transformed. Legends of Enki, the clever god of wisdom and fresh water, who shaped humanity with both kindness and mischief. Hymns and prayers written in poetic lines meant to be recited aloud in ritual contexts. These ancient stories were not just entertainment. They were explanations, attempts to understand the world. They addressed life, death, justice, and the fragile place humans held in a universe governed by unpredictable gods. The fact that they were preserved on clay rather than on parchment or palm leaves is the reason they survived at all. Fire destroys papyrus. Water erases ink. But clay, for all its fragility, can outlast empires if it is baked, accidentally or intentionally, into stone. Secrets of science and observation. Some of the most surprising tablets are not mythical or administrative, but scientific. Long before the Babylonian astronomers, Sumerian scribes were observing the skies with methodical precision. They recorded lunar cycles, sunrise patterns, and omens associated with astronomical events. They tracked the movements of planets they believed were divine messengers.
Their records demonstrate an early understanding of patterns in nature, patterns that would later evolve into mathematics, calendars, and formal astronomy. Elsewhere, tablets reveal calculations of area, length, and volume, often using complex base 60 number systems. These records show that the Sumerians could measure fields, calculate brick quantities for construction, and manage irrigation networks with impressive accuracy. What makes these tablets fascinating is that they were rarely written as science in the modern sense. They were problem-solving tools, information meant to guide work, not claim intellectual glory. That humility, ironically, is what makes them such powerful windows into the minds of early mathematicians and observers. Letters, complaints, and human emotion. Perhaps the most revealing category of tablet is the one that deals with personal communication. Some tablets record letters, complaints, apologies, instructions, warnings, and sometimes little bursts of emotion that slip through the formal tone. A few famous examples include a merchant angrily demanding repayment from a colleague who avoided him, or a wife writing instructions to her traveling husband. In these glimpses, we see the human side of Sumer, the frustrations, the expectations, the longing. The tablets revealed that thousands of years ago, people worried about many of the same things we do today. Fairness, family, obligations, friendships gone sour, promises broken. In these fragile slabs of clay, human nature feels remarkably unchanged. The tablets that sparked controversy. Among the tablets found in Sumer are a handful that contain unusual or puzzling content. Some refer to events that stretch beyond expected timelines, such as long reigning kings in the Sumerian King List. Others mention strange objects or beings that scholars debate to this day. While modern historians interpret them through the lens of symbolism, mythic exaggeration, or ritual significance, these tablets continue to generate curiosity because they blend history with the extraordinary. To the ancient writers, myth and reality often overlapped. Gods walked among humans in stories, and kings claimed divine lineage. The boundaries between literal and symbolic were not as sharp as they are today. And so these tablets remind us of something essential, that ancient people used writing to explore not only what happened, but what might have happened, what they believed had happened, and what they hoped was true. Rediscovery and the return of forgotten voices. Most tablets survived only because cities were destroyed by fire. When a building burned, thousands of clay tablets, stored in shelves or buried in archive rooms, were accidentally baked into stone. Centuries later, archaeologists would find them almost perfectly preserved beneath layers of rubble. The process of decoding them has taken decades. Scholars painstakingly translate each wedge and line, uncovering voices that had been silent for thousands of years. Sometimes these voices offer clarity. Sometimes they add confusion. But collectively, they give us the closest thing we have to a conversation with a long-vanished world. A legacy written in clay. The clay tablets of Sumer are reminders that memory is fragile, yet powerful. The scribes who pressed symbols into soft mud had no idea that their work would outlast their temples, their kings, their cities, and their entire civilization. They wrote for practical reasons, for ritual reasons,
But their words became the backbone of human history. In their quiet, unassuming way,
These tablets carry secrets that shaped our understanding of ancient life. They reveal thought patterns, fears, motivations, dreams, and systems of knowledge. And perhaps their most extraordinary truth is this: a civilization becomes immortal when it chooses to write itself down. Interpreting symbols that defy our understanding. Long before the modern world learned to read the cuneiform wedges of Sumer, long before scholars debated the meanings of the King Lists or the origins of the great flood myths, there was something else, something stranger, hidden in the clay tablets. Symbols, patterns, marks that did not behave like early writing at all. Marks that refused to fit into the neat boxes archaeologists had drawn for the development of human communication. At first, these odd symbols were dismissed as mistakes: a bored scribe doodling, a cracked tablet misread as intentional. But as more sites were excavated, from Shuruppak to Kish to the deep layers beneath Uruk, the same strange signs kept appearing. Spirals, intersecting grids, star-like wheels, humanoid shapes with exaggerated heads, and sequences of lines that did not match Sumerian numbers, trade records, or religious texts. It was as if someone or something had left a message in a language no longer spoken, maybe never fully known. The uneasy feeling among scholars. Visitors to Sumerian museums often think archaeologists are unshakable realists, people who trust only what they can measure, date, and categorize. But behind closed doors, the experts sometimes felt unsettled. The symbols didn't behave like a writing system. They didn't represent sounds, syllables, or names. They didn't encode quantities or goods. And unlike art, they weren't decorative. They repeated too precisely. Some researchers began comparing them across sites, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. These symbols were organized, as if they formed part of a structured system. But a system for what? That's where the debate started. There were three major camps. Practical notation theorists believed the symbols recorded specialized knowledge, early astronomy, navigational markers, or engineering instructions. Myth symbol scholars argued they were religious or ritualistic, perhaps predating the gods themselves. And the quiet minority whispered something bolder, that these symbols came from a culture older than Sumer, a culture we had not yet discovered. Even the whisper of that idea electrified the field, because if the symbols were older, they might belong to a forgotten chapter of humanity, or to a civilization that influenced Sumer before writing, kings, or cities existed. A tablet that changed the conversation. In 2009, during a routine cataloging project in a museum basement, a small, unassuming tablet, no larger than a modern smartphone, contained not only everyday cuneiform signs, but also a cluster of non-cuneiform symbols etched with meticulous precision. They were too sharp, too symmetrical, almost machine-like. And most shocking of all, the symbols were carved onto the tablet before the cuneiform wedges were pressed in, meaning the scribe didn't add them. He reused a much older artifact. It was a hint, maybe even proof, that these mysterious symbols belonged to a time before Sumer. Some archaeologists got chills when they realized what that implied. The Sumerians themselves might have found these symbols and used them without understanding them. Patterns that don't belong. By 2013, researchers mapped over 300 instances of these strange signs. They discovered something mind-bending. The symbols aligned with certain astronomical events, not in a vague horoscope-like way, but with stunning mathematical accuracy. Conjunctions, solstices, lunar nodes, even the rare precession of Venus across the sky. Yet these symbols appeared thousands of years earlier than the earliest confirmed Sumerian astronomical records. Impossible, unless someone before them had studied the sky with equal or greater sophistication. And stranger still, several symbols matched geometric forms that did not appear in human mathematics until the Greek era, more than 2,500 years later. How could people in 3,500–3,000 BCE depict forms that wouldn't be rediscovered until Pythagoras, Euclid, or even Renaissance-era mathematicians? Theories multiplied like wildfire. Religious? Scientific? Or something else? A radical but growing idea suggested the symbols weren't a language at all, at least in the way we think of language. Instead, they might be concept markers, a proto-system of ideas that blended time, mathematics, myth, and cosmic cycles into a single, symbolic worldview. In other words, these symbols might represent the movement of stars, the rhythm of seasons, the cycle of kingship, the rise and fall of floods, the journey of the soul, the alignment of the divine and mortal worlds. To the Sumerians, life was not divided into science, religion, and politics. Everything was one grand system. Perhaps these symbols reflected that deep unity, a worldview we have long forgotten. But one particularly baffling symbol kept emerging, a circle with 8 evenly spaced rays. Not the typical Sumerian star symbol, but something more geometric, more calculated. It appeared in temples, on pottery, on buried tablets, and even on boundary stones. What was it? A star? A compass? A map? A calendar? We don't know. Some researchers found correlations between this symbol and the positions of major ancient cities, almost like a network grid, but thousands of years earlier than mapping should have existed. Others claimed it marked sites of spiritual significance or celestial alignment. And one fringe but haunting proposal suggested the symbol represented something the Sumerians remembered but did not understand. A thing in the sky, bright and powerful, visible only at rare intervals. The emotional weight of the unknown. Interpreting these symbols wasn't just academic. It created a quiet tension, a sense that the past was bigger, stranger, and more layered than we ever imagined. Some scholars privately admitted the symbols made them uneasy, not because they implied aliens or conspiracy theories, but because they hinted at a forgotten chapter of humanity, a chapter where people possessed knowledge long before we believed they should have, a chapter erased by flood, fire, or time, a chapter Sumer inherited, preserved, and passed onward without ever truly understanding. Were these symbols the last echo of a lost world, or were they the first attempt by the Sumerians to explain a universe too vast and mysterious to grasp? Either way, the symbols refused to give up their meaning easily. Every interpretation opened more questions than answers. And most strangely, a few symbols appeared only in the deepest layers of excavation, beneath the earliest city levels, levels associated not with organized settlements, but with proto-villages and scattered communities. How could advanced symbols exist before advanced civilization? Unless civilization had an earlier seed, one we have yet to uncover. And that idea, that maybe we are missing an entire era of human history, is what keeps researchers awake at night. Hidden in clay? Encoded in silence? Waiting for someone, someday, to finally decipher them.
How modern discoveries challenge our timeline. For centuries, the story of Sumer had seemed neatly wrapped,
Another ancient civilization that rose from the plains of Mesopotamia invented a few world-changing things, left behind some enigmatic tablets, and then quietly disappeared into the long river of time. But the deeper scholars dug, sometimes literally, sometimes through increasingly baffling digital reconstructions, the more they realized that nothing about Sumer was as tidy as once believed. In fact, every new discovery felt like someone was tugging at a thread woven deep within history's fabric, loosening the pattern we thought we understood. It began subtly, a few anomalies here, an odd carbon-dated shard there, a single tablet that didn't match the expected chronology, an artifact that shouldn't have existed at the layer it was found in. Archaeologists shrugged at first. After all, the Earth shifts, layers compress, rivers flood, and ancient cities collapse upon themselves. The land rearranges history, whether we like it or not. But then the anomalies multiplied. And suddenly it wasn't one loose thread, it was the entire tapestry shifting beneath modern feet. Dr. Leora Samet, one of the world's leading experts on Mesopotamian chronology, never set out to disrupt centuries of established timelines. She merely wanted to understand why a particular ceremonial cylinder seal, one she'd seen dozens of times in museum catalogs, seemed older than the strata it had been pulled from. The seal's iconography, tools, and clay composition aligned with a period far earlier than the level in which the excavation team had found it. So Leora asked for more samples, more seals, more tablets, more debris, enough data to reassure her that she wasn't imagining things. The reassurance never came. Instead, the pattern became undeniable. Objects from different centuries were showing up together, as if time itself inside Sumer's buried cities had twisted and compressed like clay being kneaded. And even more troubling, some pieces appeared older than the cities they were buried beneath. Older than Sumer itself. This was not the sort of thing scholars liked to hear. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, in a quiet lab in Kyoto, another puzzle was forming. A young researcher named Masato Inoue had been analyzing microscopic wear patterns on Sumerian bronze tools, when he noticed something strange. Some tools displayed precision-level crafting methods far more advanced than anything expected for early Bronze Age metallurgy. When Masato ran comparative analyses against metal artifacts from Egypt, the Indus Valley, and prehistoric Europe, the data pointed towards something baffling. Sumerian bronze workers may have been using techniques similar to cultures thousands of years younger. Either that, or our timeline was wrong. Masato submitted his findings cautiously. They were met with polite nods, narrowed eyes, and 1,000 whispered debates in academic corridors. Then came the greatest shock of all. In 2024, during satellite-assisted ground-penetrating imaging of southern Iraq, researchers discovered what looked like the foundations of an enormous, ancient geometric layout, a city grid far older than any previously known settlement in the region. When excavation teams reached the outskirts of the site, they expected to find primitive tools, crude pottery, perhaps the remains of nomadic shelters. Instead, they found complex drainage channels, multi-room structures, and administrative tablets, written in early proto-cuneiform. The problem? The soil layers placed the site almost 1,000 years before Sumer was supposed to exist. History shuddered. Theories erupted like desert storms. Some scholars insisted the dating was wrong. Others argued the city must belong to an unknown civilization that predated and influenced Sumer. And a daring few suggested that Sumer itself may have roots so ancient that everything we thought we knew about the first civilization needed rewriting. Back in Leora's office, surrounded by photographs of artifacts that seemed to mock her earlier confidence, she sat with her head in her hands. She had spent her entire career believing Sumer represented humanity's first organized leap into city life, writing, administration, and monumental architecture. That was the framework she had lived in, taught students in, published papers in, and now it felt like quicksand. But as the confusion grew, something else emerged, something exhilarating. There were patterns in the anomalies, strange consistencies, a hidden logic. If you lined up all the anomalous artifacts by material composition, iconography, and inscription style, a faint chronological thread appeared, like a submerged walkway revealed only when the tide pulled back. And that thread pointed to something astonishing. Sumer may have been built on top of the remnants of an even older cultural network, one that stretched across time like a shadow we had never bothered to see. It wasn't a single civilization, nor a single moment in history, but a slow buildup of knowledge passed like whispers through shifting generations, a continuity that refused to fit inside the neat boundaries scholars had drawn. For the first time, Leora wondered if the ancients knew exactly what they were doing when they wrote the King Lists, those bizarre accounts of rulers with impossibly long reigns, stretching back into mythical epochs. What if the King Lists were not literal, not metaphorical, but something else entirely? An attempt to preserve a memory of ages whose timelines bled and overlapped. What if the ancient Sumerians weren't confused? What if we were? Masato, upon hearing of the new anomalous city, took a flight to Iraq. He and Leora met on the dig site, both carrying stacks of data, both exhausted from too many sleepless nights. Together, they examined a series of clay tablets freshly pulled from the western quadrant. The symbols were early, so early they looked like prototypes of later cuneiform, but the contents were even stranger. Some tablets recorded crop yields and administrative inventories, as expected, but others described knowledge being preserved after a great loss, as if the writers believed themselves to be living in the aftermath of an older world's collapse. The tablets spoke of rebuilding, relearning, reclaiming techniques formerly known to those before the waters. They mentioned masters of stone, keepers of celestial charts, and artisans who remembered methods from the age of fires. It almost sounded like cultural memory from a civilization erased by catastrophe. Leora felt something tighten in her chest. A connection, tentative, frightening, began to form. Were these tablets describing the aftermath of a prehistoric flood? A collapse? A forgotten age of knowledge? As if Sumer was not the beginning, but a rebirth? The more the team uncovered, the clearer the pattern became. Instead of rising from nothing, Sumer seemed to have inherited fragments of older knowledge, restarting a chain that had snapped long before recorded time. And suddenly, modern discoveries weren't just anomalies. They were clues pointing to a forgotten chapter in human history, a chapter long erased, long buried, long dismissed as myth. A chapter where timelines overlapped, where knowledge rose and fell like empires, and where the first cities may have been far older than the textbooks dared to suggest. As the sun dipped behind the distant dunes, casting the dig site in a warm, ancient glow, Leora stood over the uncovered tablets and felt a shiver, not of fear, but awe. History wasn't breaking. It was unfolding, revealing, and the story of Sumer was only beginning.
On the legacy of Sumer. In the stillness of the desert night, long after the excavation teams had packed up their tools and the air buzzed only with the quiet hum of generators,
Dr. Leora Samet remained alone at the edge of the dig site. She sat on a low crate, elbows on her knees, staring across the ruins of a world that had refused to stay buried. Above her, the stars shimmered like silent witnesses, the same constellations the ancient Sumerians had once mapped with a precision that challenged imagination. For the first time in her career, Leora wasn't thinking about carbon dates or stratigraphy or what new paper she needed to write. She wasn't thinking about academic debates or cautious wording or the 1,000 tiny battles fought in scholarly journals. She was thinking about legacy. Not the kind etched in stone, but the kind that breathed through time. Because Sumer, she realized, was not simply a civilization of the past. It was a mirror, one that reflected both where humanity had come from and where it was still going. Earlier that day, she and Masato and Oe had finalized their report on the anomalous tablets. The findings were going to unsettle the academic world and ignite it. Their conclusion was humble, cautious, but unmistakable. Sumer was not an isolated beginning, it was a continuation, a bridge spanning lost ages, and that changed everything. For centuries, historians had portrayed Sumer as humanity's first leap into complexity, a sudden spark in the dark. But the tablets suggested something far more nuanced. They hinted at memories of older worlds, older methods, older catastrophes. They spoke of knowledge preserved, revived, adapted. They showed people striving, rebuilding, reaching upward again after something, no one yet knew what, had dragged them downward. In those stories, Leora felt a pull, a connection, not just to Sumer, but to something profoundly human, the instinct to rebuild, to remember, to push forward, even when the past seems lost. It made the ruins around her feel alive. Masato walked up quietly behind her, hands in his jacket pockets. He had the same dazed look she'd worn for days now, a mixture of exhaustion and awe. "You're still out here," he said softly. "I wasn't ready to go back yet," Leora admitted. "It's strange, isn't it? We came here expecting answers, and instead, the questions just got bigger." Masato chuckled gently. History's favorite trick. But then his expression softened as he gazed over the ruins. Still, it's impossible not to feel humbled by this place. Leora nodded. Sumer doesn't feel ancient anymore. It feels close. She looked at the ziggurat fragments rising like broken teeth against the starlit horizon. They built these structures believing the gods could descend through them. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was that humans could rise. Masato smiled. A symbolic staircase. To memory, she added. To continuity. Their discoveries over the past months had reshaped every narrative they once trusted. The inventions, writing, irrigation, governance, astronomy, the architecture, the rituals, the myths that had inspired stories for millennia, all of it was still astonishing, but no longer mysterious in the way scholars once believed. Instead of isolated genius, Sumer seemed to embody accumulated human resilience. Those early scribes sitting in dimly lit schoolrooms, pressing reeds into clay, weren't merely inventing writing, they were safeguarding everything their ancestors had learned. They were ensuring that the next collapse, whenever it came, wouldn't wipe the slate clean. The early astronomers weren't just charting the heavens, they were aligning themselves with cycles older than any nation. The metal workers weren't tinkering in isolation, they were perfecting inherited techniques. The kings weren't simply asserting power, they were trying to stabilize something fragile and newly rebuilt. And the myths? Those vast, poetic memories of floods, gods, and origins weren't naive at all. They were echoes of real struggles, real disasters, real resets. Sumer was a legacy of persistence, a quiet declaration. We were here. We learned. We survived, and we passed it on. As the wind shifted and carried the scent of cooling desert sands, Leora felt a profound stillness settle over her. She had spent her life studying civilizations as though they were distant, unreachable worlds. But now, sitting among these broken stones, she realized she wasn't outside of history at all. She was inside it. And so was everyone else. The legacy of Sumer wasn't locked in museums or forgotten beneath the river-silted plains of Iraq. It lived on in every ledger, every contract, every city grid, every written word. It lived in the way modern societies organize themselves, learned from the past, tracked the stars, built monuments, and tried, over and over, to make meaning from chaos. The ancient world wasn't gone. It had simply changed forms. Masato took a seat beside her. "Do you think they knew?" he asked quietly. "The people who carved those tablets, do you think they realized how far their influence would reach?" Leora thought for a long moment. "Maybe not in scale, but I think they knew they were saving something important. Saving. A way of being human. A way of remembering, a way of rebuilding whenever the world fractures." Masato leaned back, letting her words settle. "If that's true, then we're part of the same chain." Leora smiled. "We always were." Later, as she walked back toward the temporary research tents, she paused to look over the dig site one last time. Floodlights bathed the ruins in a cold, artificial glow, but she imagined how the place must have looked thousands of years ago, alive with footsteps, laughter, arguments, rituals, children running between buildings, merchants shouting over prices, scribes hunched over clay tablets, priests climbing the ziggurat steps at dawn, an entire civilization breathing. And she realized that even though the story of Sumer had ended long ago, its true legacy had never stopped unfolding. It wasn't about beginnings or endings. It was about continuity, a bridge of ideas stretching across thousands of years. The past was not a static relic. It was a living inheritance. And now, thanks to the discoveries she and her team had helped uncover, perhaps the world would finally understand just how deep that inheritance ran. As the night deepened and the first hints of dawn began to pale the eastern horizon, Leora whispered a quiet farewell to the ruins. Not goodbye, just farewell, as one traveler offers to another on a long, intertwined journey. Because Sumer's story didn't end in the dust of forgotten cities. It lived in the questions we asked, the knowledge we sought, and the fragile, beautiful continuity of human curiosity. And as long as humanity kept searching, remembering, and rebuilding, the legacy of Sumer, the first storytellers, the first record keepers, the first architects of organized life, would remain alive, not buried, not lost, simply evolving. Just like us.